Jon Snow stood atop a windswept ridge, the bitter cold of the north biting at his cheeks. Ghost crouched by his side, tail twitching, ears pricked as if sensing the tension that radiated through the air. Snow flurries settled onto Jon's black hair and patched cloak, but despite the chill, his gray eyes were fixed on the horizon where torchlight flickered like distant stars. Below, thousands of common folk gathered around a makeshift camp. Their voices rose as a somber hum in the twilight, a mixture of fear, uncertainty, and a blossoming hope. Each of them had left behind fields, hovels, shops, and foundries to join a cause as improbable as it was bold. The dream of a realm ruled by its people rather than by lords. Jon exhaled a plume of breath, then turned his head at the soft tread of approaching footsteps. Gendry Baratheon, or simply Gendry, as he was known to the masses, was moving up the ridge. The young smith's build was sturdy. Muscles earned from years of swinging a hammer had grown more defined since he'd taken up arms. His features were set in grim determination, but his eyes held a glow that Jon recognized. It was the same quiet resolve that had kept Gendry alive in the darkest of days. Jon had known Gendry since the war against the Night King. Back then, they were allies by circumstance, barely aware of each other's histories, yet entwined in the same fate that bound them all, life or death for the realm. Now, in the wake of new conflicts, their bond had crystallized into something more. Gendry was King Robert's bastard, legitimized at one point for political convenience, but the young man had never fully embraced or even desired the trappings of nobility. He was a blacksmith's apprentice at heart, a man more comfortable with a hammer in hand than a crown upon his brow. Yet, in the swirl of chaos that ravaged the Seven Kingdoms, people saw him as Robert's blood, and in that they found a spark of faith. Jon, for his part, had once been king in the north, had once known what it meant to sit at the head of armies. He had relinquished all that to broker peace and spare lives. Fate, or the gods, if indeed they cared, had not granted him any lasting reprieve. With a war-weary realm still reeling from the destruction wrought by dragons and White Walkers, a new wave of discontent and tyranny arose among the surviving lords. One might have hoped that the horrors and the near extinction of humanity would have taught them mercy. Instead, those who had seized power used it to cement their dominion, turning their attentions to punishing their enemies and collecting heavy tolls from their own small folk. Jon's sense of honor and duty was not bound by the old feudal codes alone. It was shaped by his experiences beyond the wall, among free folk who recognized no lords, and by his brotherhood in the Night's Watch, which taught him that service to the realm mattered more than service to any single king. So when the crush of taxes and new levies fell harshly upon the small folk, when beatings, forced conscription, and starvation became daily truths for peasants from Winterfell to King's Landing, Jon could not look away. He remembered the moment it all pivoted. He had been riding alongside Gendry, traveling incognito through the Heartlands, when they stumbled upon a peasant village razed by a local lord's men. Punitive action for failing to pay the demanded tribute in time. Smoke lingered in the crisp air. The stench of charred wood and flesh clung to the back of Jon's throat. Shivering survivors huddled in a barn, traumatized eyes watching the riders fearfully, expecting the worst. Gendry had dismounted, approached them gently, and discovered a dying boy. The child, no older than 8, had taken an arrow in his side. Gendry knelt, hands trembling, trying to staunch the bleeding. The boy's lips quivered with pain, but he had enough breath to whisper that they tried to raise the coin. They truly tried, but it had never been enough. Then he slipped away. Gendry's tears darkened the mud underfoot, and Jon felt something break inside him. This was no war of the living against the dead, no war for the Iron Throne's rightful occupant. This was cruelty for its own sake, a torment inflicted by those lords who had survived the last battles and were eager to remind the small folk that power belonged to them alone. Jon had taken Gendry by the shoulder, though he had no words. They both saw what had to be done. Someone had to stand up for the people. Over time, word spread quietly of 2 leaders who traveled the countryside, calling upon the powerless to rise. At first, it was just a trickle of interest from those who had nothing left. The ranks of followers began with the survivors of that burned village. Then came another handful from a town not far away, likewise brutalized by the same lord's men. As they ventured further, the crowds swelled. Artisans, farmers, blacksmiths, millers, washerwomen, innkeeps, cooks, travelers, and even a few hedge knights and disillusioned soldiers answered the call. The more the people came, the sharper Jon's sense of responsibility grew. He was no longer the reluctant commander. Necessity demanded he lead. At his side, Gendry was equally committed. If either man had wavered in purpose, they found mutual strength in the other's conviction. It was not long before they established a semblance of an encampment in the southern foothills near the Trident, well away from major seats of power but close enough to be relevant. There, blacksmiths hammered out weapons from scavenged steel, grizzled soldiers from old wars trained farmers to hold pikes in formation, and the entire community pooled its meager resources to feed the swelling masses. In the hush of the first dawn after settling at the foothills, Jon walked among the people, greeting each group, hearing their stories. Some had been maimed in the previous wars. Some had lost every last member of their families to violence or disease, and some had simply wandered in, uncertain but desperate. For the first time in their lives, many of them sensed they were part of something larger than themselves, a cause that promised not a new king or queen but the radical idea of common governance. Jon knew that if they failed, the reprisal from the lords would be swift and merciless. He had heard the rumors about small folk revolts in the past, like the one led by that old figure, the shepherd, during the Dance of the Dragon centuries ago, or the riot that had erupted in King's Landing when Joffrey was a boy. All had ended in bloodshed, but the realm had never been so exhausted, never so close to a tipping point. Now, the old bonds of fealty were cracking under the weight of continuous strife. People were not as fearful as they once were. Many had lost everything already. That, Jon recognized, was both a curse and a powerful advantage. Gendry reached him on the ridge and cleared his throat. Jon looked from the horizon to the young man. They exchanged a curt nod. There would be a gathering soon, an address to the masses. Gendry's hammer hung from his belt, the same one he used to craft armor in the past, but it had now become a symbol as much as a weapon. Where once the hammer had represented his father's memory, Robert Baratheon's favored warhammer, now it stood for the forging of a new order. Jon led the way down the ridge, Ghost trotting beside him. As they descended, the murmuring in the camp grew. Thousands of eyes turned toward them, hush falling in ripples across the throng. Jon took his place at an elevated spot, a simple wooden crate pressed into the ground, while Gendry stood a few paces behind him, arms crossed over his broad chest. The tension in the crowd was palpable. Some were frightened, others determined. Jon let silence reign for a moment. Then he spoke, voice echoing in the stillness. All my life, I have served something I believed in. First, it was the Night's Watch, sworn to protect the realm from threats in the north. Then, in the face of the dead, I stood with anyone who would fight. I was crowned king in the north, and relinquished it, believing there was a better way. He paused, letting his words settle. But I look around and see that the old ways are as cruel as ever, fueled by greed and fear. The lords who survived the wars do not remember the horrors we've seen. They only remember they have power. And when people have power, they too often cling to it, no matter who suffers. We have seen it again and again. A weak cheer rose, but it was swiftly muffled by the collective anxiety of those assembled. Jon resumed, "We stand here together because we have chosen not to remain silent. We have seen children starve, villages burned for not paying taxes, men and women beaten for raising their voices. We say no more. No one here desires a new tyranny, a new single ruler. We mean to forge a new order, something that respects the sacrifices of us all." He stepped aside, allowing Gendry to come forward. The young man was not a born orator, but his sincerity was evident, and the crowd responded to that with far more gusto than to polished speeches. I never wanted any part of the iron seat. I never thought the blood in my veins mattered. I was just a boy with a hammer, taught by a master smith in Flea Bottom. I learned how people live when they've got nothing. I learned how they die when the powerful forget they exist. I've seen lords treat small folk like animals. I've seen the lords of Westeros put their petty feuds above the lives of the people who feed them, arm them, and build their castles." He let out a long breath, seeming to gather courage from the quiet hush of the onlookers. "You all know these truths as well as I do. We have a chance to tear down the old ways, or at least break them enough to start building something new. No more lords who come to your home and take what they want. No more lords who force you to fight their battles or starve in the fields. We want a realm guided by those who live in it, by the small folk. We want a council chosen by you, the people. It won't be easy, and it won't come without a fight." He raised his hammer high, its dark steel head gleaming even in the faint light. "But by the gods, if we stand together, we can do it." This time, a roar erupted from the crowd. It wasn't uniform. Some still cowered, uncertain whether they would be punished even for this display of defiance. But it was enough. Jon felt a surge of warmth in his chest. Not quite hope, but that stirring sense that a path existed. A path that might just lead to a realm transformed. After the address, the gathering dispersed into smaller knots of discussion around campfires. Some strategized about tactics, how to defend themselves if the local lord's forces attacked, how to organize supply lines, how to ensure the people from different regions worked in harmony. Others tried to quell the nervousness of family members who feared a swift retribution. In the center of it all, the spirit of solidarity grew. Away from the crowd, in a tent made from stitched hides, Gendry and Jon conferred with a circle of trusted companions. Davos Seaworth was among them. He had come out of hiding to join the cause, having once sworn loyalty to Stannis and then to Jon. He had grown weary of the endless cycles of noble infighting. Still keen of mind, with an instinct for reading people, Davos offered level-headed counsel. Tormund Giantsbane had traveled south as well, preferring the free air of the northern mountains to the constraints of any lord's hall. He joined the revolt less out of a political ideology and more out of loyalty to Jon and an abiding hatred for oppression. He recognized no kings and was quick to remind people that the free folk did not kneel. Nevertheless, he found common ground in the movement's central thrust: that no one man or woman should wield absolute power. Other figures wove in and out of that inner circle. A handful of hedge knights who had grown disillusioned with broken promises from their lords, a few septons and septas outraged by the cruelty inflicted upon their flocks, and even a couple of maesters who had broken from the citadel, believing that knowledge should serve all, not simply the highborn. They planned their first true act of defiance. The lords had begun to notice the swelling ranks of commoners gathering around the Trident. Soon, ravens carrying demands for explanation or orders to disband arrived, each unanswered. The movement had to show that it would not cower or simply vanish at the first threat. Word reached them of a minor lord who'd been terrorizing villages near Harrenhal, extorting triple taxes under the excuse that his fortress needed repairs after the last war. This lord's men roamed the countryside, beating men and assaulting women who could not produce enough coin. It was, in Jon's mind, the perfect flashpoint. If they could free these villages, protect them from the tyrant, they could demonstrate that the revolt was no mere riot of peasants. It was a new power, one that could defend itself and its people. So they marched quietly at first. Small folk along the way welcomed them, providing shelter in barns and food from meager stores. Children looked in awe at Gendry's warhammer and the swirl of Jon's cloak. Whispers spread like wildfire. "They stand for us?" The rumor went, "They fight for us." That alone emboldened those who had spent their entire lives under the heel of one lord or another. On the outskirts of a hamlet perched near the rolling green fields that led toward Harrenhal's black silhouette, the first open confrontation began. Lord Byrell's soldiers, fewer than 100 but armed with swords, spears, and crossbows, had set up a watchtower along the river. They saw the ragtag host approaching, a motley band of half-armored peasant levies, blacksmiths, and traveling folk, and they sneered. War had taught them that amateurs died quickly on the battlefield. But these peasants had been trained, at least in the basics, by soldiers who had fought in real wars. They had heart, and they had the advantage of numbers. Jon rode Ghost into the thick of it, sword in hand. As the crossbow bolts flew, Tormund let out a wild roar, charging the tower line with an axe that looked too big for any normal man to wield. Davos stayed behind with a rearguard, ensuring the main host stayed cohesive. Gendry led a flanking maneuver with a dozen stout fighters, his hammer swinging like a thunderbolt. They fought in the mud and mist, a grim and dirty clash. Jon disarmed 2 crossbowmen, knocking them out rather than killing them outright. Gendry crushed a spear shaft with a single blow from his hammer, scattering the soldier who held it. Some of the peasants, newly armed with steel, faltered at the sight of blood, but others pressed on, spurred by rage over the abuses they'd suffered. The Lord's men were well-trained, but their morale was brittle. They had grown used to terrorizing farmers, not waging a proper battle against an organized resistance. In less than an hour, the watchtower was in the rebels' hands. They tended to the wounded, both friend and foe, while a few villagers who had suffered under Lord Byrell arrived, cheering. The small victory ignited something deeper. The peasants realized they could indeed fight back. They were not powerless. Many had lost family or friends in wars they never understood, fought for kings they never chose. Now this war was theirs to fight with a clear enemy, the old system that bled them dry. Lord Byrell's retaliation was swift. When word reached him of the defeat at the watchtower, he mustered the full might of his household guard and rode out to engage these upstart peasants. But Gendry and Jon anticipated such a response. They set up ambushes in the nearby woods, using the terrain to their advantage. The old songs always told stories of cunning free companies or legendary lords employing ambuscades. Now the peasants did the same, bridging centuries of warfare knowledge with their own resilience. When Byrell arrived with near 200 men, the rebels melted into the forest, raining down arrows from homemade longbows and crossbows. Only a handful of the peasants were skilled archers, but the confusion it sowed among Byrell's ranks was enough. Then, a second wave of rebels surged from the flanks, driving pikes and spears into the cavalry's sides. Horses reared and screamed. Men shouted curses, and the forest floor was slick with mud and blood. Gendry smashed Byrell's personal banner to the ground, toppling the heraldic crest in a single stroke that left the banner-bearer dazed. Jon, leading a detachment from the other side, forced Byrell's line to crumble. For all the rebels lacked in professional discipline, they more than made up for it with fervor and cunning. Tormund barreled through the confusion, howling like a beast, and nearly took Byrell's head in one wild swing. The Lord cowered behind his shield. Sensing an inevitable defeat, Byrell's men began to scatter into the woods, leaving their leader vulnerable. Soon, Byrell found himself dismounted, at the mercy of Jon, Gendry, and a ring of peasants brandishing makeshift weapons. Byrell's face was a mixture of fury and fear as he glared at his captors. "You'll all hang for this," he spat. "You think the other lords will tolerate such rebellion?" Jon's voice was cold, tempered steel. "I think they'll be too busy dealing with their own lands. But if they come, we'll meet them with the same resolve." Byrell tried to posture, claiming that House Byrell was an ancient line, that the king in King's Landing would crush them all for such treason. Gendry's jaw clenched. "You forget that you're speaking to a king's bastard," he said with a grim half-smile. "Your line's age means nothing to these people. They are through being trampled." One of the peasants, a woman with a bruise on her cheek and eyes burning with righteous anger, said, "Lord Byrell, you had my husband flogged for missing a tax payment by a single copper. You took our last horse. We were days from starvation when these people arrived. Do you deny it?" The Lord fell silent. He looked around, face pale, perhaps realizing that the illusions of status and legacy meant nothing in this circle of armed commoners. Jon seized that moment. "We want no more bloodshed," he said. "Give up your titles and your lands. We will deliver you to a people's council. There you will answer for what you've done." Byrell laughed bitterly, as though the thought of standing before a people's council was more insulting than mere imprisonment. "A council of peasants? You can't be serious. You can kill me, but you'll never see me bow to the likes of you." Gendry's gaze flicked to Jon, uncertain. They had not yet decided how to handle lords who refused any form of justice beyond the old laws of the realm. They had no illusions that such trials would be recognized by other lords. But it was the principle that counted. While the peasants clamored for immediate execution, recalling every cruelty visited upon them, Jon and Gendry insisted on a form of due process, even if it was one they were inventing as they went. They compromised by placing Byrell under guarded captivity, announcing that his fate would be decided once a formal structure of popular justice was set. The old lord spat at them, but it mattered little. Word of Byrell's defeat and capture traveled fast. His household was dissolved. Many of his men, forced into service by Byrell's taxes and threats, eagerly switched sides once free. The villages he had oppressed flocked to the rebel banner, providing more supplies and volunteers. Some of the rank-and-file soldiers had no great love for their lord, either. They took oaths to Jon or Gendry or to the cause itself. Each new oath was less about personal fealty to a lord and more about the shared vision, the building of a realm that would no longer crush the weak under the strong. In King's Landing, where the Red Keep loomed over the city, panic began to spread among the lords who'd survived the War of the Five Kings and the scouring by the Dragon Queen. They received ravens detailing a large body of small folk openly taking arms, capturing a lord, and refusing to submit. Such a thing was almost unthinkable. Many believed it was just a passing riot that would be quashed by the first show of force. But new reports contradicted that assumption. This was no riot. It was an army or close enough with leaders who were seasoned in war. Even so, the lords gathered in the small council chamber with a haughty confidence. Noble arrogance had not been crushed even by the worst calamities the realm had witnessed. They believed that, at most, a few thousand peasants were making noise. They believed those peasants would scatter like frightened sheep if a real force of knights and men-at-arms rode against them. But as the days passed, fresh rumors continued to arrive of entire villages joining this rebellion. Some said there were pockets of the rebellion springing up in the Reach, in the Riverlands, even in the Westerlands. Everywhere the small folk felt the weight of oppressive taxes, they found reason to take up arms. In the rebel camp, Jon and Gendry had little time to dwell on how the lords might respond. They were too busy dealing with the logistical reality of creating a new society, even on a small scale. Tents sprouted like mushrooms after a rain. Makeshift latrines had to be dug. Food had to be rationed. Structures of command had to be established without falling into the trap of becoming feudal liegelords themselves. Jon insisted that each region's recruits form their own councils to elect spokespeople. Gendry agreed but worried that time was short. The lords would eventually muster a substantial force, perhaps even unify to crush this rebellion. Davos, voice calm in the center of heated debate, noted that forging alliances beyond the common folk might help. The Iron Islands, Dorne, or even the Vale might hold lords who were discontent with the current regime. But Tormund scoffed. From his perspective, seeking alliances with any traditional lord was a mistake. The free folk had once allied with Jon because it was a matter of survival against the dead. But Tormund warned that lords rarely acted out of altruism or respect for the powerless. Yet they all recognized that if they did not find some measure of recognition, their movement risked being labeled nothing more than banditry. Jon said they should not measure themselves by the nobility's definition of legitimacy. They had legitimacy from the people, he argued. They were forging a realm by and for the people. Gendry admired Jon's vision but remained pragmatic. Without strategic alliances, the revolt would be hard-pressed to survive a full-scale assault from combined noble forces. They compromised. Gendry penned letters, not as a supplicant but as an equal, to certain houses rumored to be less oppressive. He wrote to some in the Vale, to a few in the Stormlands who might still honor the Baratheon name if not the cause. Jon had Samwell Tarly discreetly send ravens to the Citadel, urging them to remain neutral at least, not to declare the movement an abomination. It was a desperate gamble. Sam's position in Old Town was precarious, and many maesters scorned anything that smelled of revolution. Meanwhile, the rebels solidified a working structure in their main camp. They held assemblies each eve, discussing rationing, strategy, and even passing judgments for crimes within their ranks. It was not perfect. Crime and resentment existed among them just as it does anywhere, But for the first time in living memory, peasants were judging themselves, setting rules that applied equally to everyone in the camp. One man was brought forth for stealing bread, but the assembly learned he had a starving child. Instead of flogging him, they worked out an arrangement to see that the child was fed, and the man labored extra hours in the forges. It was rough, but it was a justice that the people felt they owned. As word of these assemblies spread, more folk arrived. Refugees who had never held a sword in their lives came, drawn by the promise of freedom. Some came from as far as the Reach, carrying barley or seeds of local grains, offering them to the common store. Skilled craftsmen from Lannisport risked their lives to travel east, searching for a place where their work wouldn't be taxed to ruin. A handful of hedge knights arrived, still wearing tattered remnants of once proud sigils, but openly admitting they found more honor fighting for the people than serving lords who no longer paid them. Each new addition put a strain on resources, but also swelled the sense that something monumental was happening. Jon, Gendry, and their closest advisors spent long hours each night in what had become a de facto command tent, exchanging intelligence, revising supply calculations, and planning defensive strategies. Ghost prowled the edges of the camp at night, a silent guardian with red eyes that glowed like embers in the moonlight. The direwolf's presence reminded the recruits that Jon was not just any man. He was the stark-blooded warrior who had once faced the army of the dead and lived, that carried weight. In the minds of many, Jon's near-mythic reputation was matched only by Gendry's legacy as the last living scion of Robert Baratheon, the man who had toppled the Targaryens decades ago. The irony that Gendry was toppling a new order of lords was not lost on them. At times, Jon would steal a moment's rest outside the tent, gazing at the stars, haunted by the memory of all the battles he'd fought. He recalled Hardhome, the long night, the final stand against the undead, and the flames of Dragonfire that scorched King's Landing. Every time he had fought for others, and every time he had thought the horror might end. Yet here he was again, preparing for war. But this war felt different. He fought not to place a single ruler on a throne, but to dismantle the very notion that people must forever be ruled by those who claim birthright. That gave him the closest thing to hope he'd felt in years. Then came the news they dreaded. A grand host was assembling. Several lords, some from the Crownlands, some from the Reach, some from the Westerlands, had banded together, aiming to crush the rebellion in a single decisive blow. They were mustering at the old battlefield along the Gold Road, not far from the spot where Daenerys Targaryen had once routed the Lannister forces with Dragonfire. The location was no coincidence. The lords wanted to make a statement that they would never allow the peasants to seize power. Some said their combined force might number 10,000 or more, with heavy knights, cavalry, and siege engines. In comparison, the rebels had more people, maybe 15,000 if one counted every able body, but only a fraction of them were well-trained. Weapons were scarce, especially swords and armor. Most fought with spears, axes, and improvised gear. They had no heavy cavalry, only a few hundred mounted riders who were mostly outriders and hunters. Yet, morale was high, and they knew the terrain around the Trident and the Riverlands better than many of the Lord's men. Jon called a council of all the elected spokespeople. They gathered in a wide clearing at dusk, torches set in a circle. Hundreds listened, the largest group they had convened to date. He explained the threat, the size of the approaching host. There were gasps, uncertain murmurs. Many had never faced a real army before, but the fear gave way to fierce resolve when Gendry bellowed, "They think we'll scatter. They think we're just rabble. Let's show them the iron in our spine. Let's show them we can fight for our own freedom better than any lord fights to keep his chain of slaves." The assembly roared its agreement. Davos advised caution, reminding them they might do well to meet the lords in smaller skirmishes rather than an open-field battle. Tormund simply grinned, bloodlust in his eyes, calling for a direct assault to break the knight's spirit. In the end, they decided on a strategy that combined ambush tactics with the possibility of a main engagement. They would use the geography around the Trident's forks, rivers, hills, and woods to chip away at the Lord's forces. If forced into a pitched battle, they would form a shield wall braced by pikes, archers on the flanks, and mobile units darting in and out to harass. It would be a chaotic affair, but the rebels believed chaos might favor them. Preparations lasted days. Weapons were fashioned at a frantic pace. Sharpened stakes were prepared to deter cavalry charges. Scouts were sent to observe the Lord's movements, returning with news of their approach. Tensions simmered in the camp, culminating in a final night of calm before the storm. People sang old songs around fires, some praying to the seven, others to the old gods, the drowned god, or simply hoping the wind favored them. Jon stayed awake until the early hours, pacing beside Ghost. He replayed the plan over in his mind, acknowledging all its weaknesses. But he had no illusions that war could be avoided. If they wanted the realm to change, they would have to face the full wrath of the entrenched powers. And in the heart of night, he made peace with that knowledge. Morning dawned cool and damp. A thick fog clung to the low ground, muffling sound and obscuring sight lines. Perfect for an ambush, but also risky if communications broke down among the rebel units. The scouts reported that the first wave of the Lord's army had set up a forward camp a league away, near a bend in the river. Jon and Gendry moved their forces into position, quietly crossing a shallow ford at dawn. The plan was for archers hidden in the treeline to unleash a volley once the Lord's forward ranks were in range, then draw them into the woods where smaller detachments waited. Meanwhile, Tormund's group would try to flank them along a ridge. If the forward camp was scattered, the main body behind it might hesitate to advance, buying time or even sowing confusion. But the Lord's commanders were not entirely without cunning. They expected some form of ambush. Their outriders probed the woods, and soon shouts rang out. The clash began earlier than planned, and a swirl of chaos engulfed the foggy battlefield. Crossbow bolts and arrows whistled through the damp air. Swords and axes clashed, hooves thundered. Men cried out and fell on both sides. Jon fought on foot, Longclaw swinging in steady arcs. Ghost darted between the chaos, snarling at enemy horses, causing riders to fall in terror. Gendry's hammer rose and fell, but he'd learned to keep his wits in the thick of combat. He led his men in cohesive strikes, pulling back when the knights tried to form a heavy cavalry charge, then darting forward again as soon as the horsemen were disorganized. In pockets where peasants faced knights on open ground, the disparity in arms was stark. Men in crude leathers and patchy mail struggled to hold off the disciplined charges. Blood ran in rivulets across the muddy field, and the screams of the wounded blended with the clamor of steel. Yet the rebels' numbers and ferocity took a toll on the Lord's men. And for every line of spearmen forced back, another line emerged from the fog, defiant. Farther along the bend in the river, the Lord's main host advanced. Their banners, once bright with heraldry, were half shrouded by the mist. Thousands of men, knights, pikemen, men-at-arms, poured forward. Jon realized they risked being caught between the forward camp and the main body if they didn't withdraw to more defensible ground. He signaled a retreat to the woods, horns echoing the command. The rebels pulled back. The Lord's men cheered, thinking the peasant rabble was breaking. But in truth, it was a tactical maneuver. As the knights advanced into the woods in pursuit, they found themselves navigating dense undergrowth and twisting game trails. Suddenly, volley after volley of arrows rained down. Large nets were sprung from hidden positions, entangling horses and riders alike. Peasant fighters dropped from trees or rose from trenches, spears braced. The forest erupted into a storm of screams, whinnying horses, and splintering wood. The Lord's vanguard, confused and battered, fell into disarray. Seizing the moment, Gendry led a charge from the flank, hammering the panicked men. Tormund burst from the other side like a savage spirit of the forest, slashing and yelling obscenities. Davos guided a reserve to cut off any escape route, though he insisted on offering quarter to men who threw down their arms. Dozens of the Lord's men surrendered, some kneeling in the mud, others weeping or cursing. But it wasn't yet a decisive victory. In the distance, the bulk of the noble host loomed, forming ranks on open ground. If the rebels emerged from the woods to face them in a straightforward battle, they would face unstoppable cavalry charges. The day was not won. Messenger runners scurried about, carrying orders from Jon. Hold the edges of the woods, do not engage on open ground. The lords would have to come to them. The standoff lasted hours. The morning fog lifted, revealing a grim tableau. Bodies sprawled across the river bend, broken banners listing in the breeze. Smoke hung in the air where fires had ignited brush. By midday, the Lords Generals decided to advance carefully, forming a wide semicircle to encircle the forest. The rebels saw the maneuver developing. Jon realized that if they allowed themselves to be surrounded, eventually the lords would flush them out or starve them. They had to strike before the circle closed. But how? The open field favored the knights. Gendry proposed a bold plan. If they split their forces, sacrificing a portion in a feigned head-on assault, the rest might swing around to hit the knights' flank from the riverside. It was the kind of plan that carried a high risk. Those who led the frontal charge might be slaughtered. But if it worked, the lords' lines could be broken. In the hush of the command meeting, many balked. Who would volunteer for near-certain death? It was then that one of the older peasants, a man named Willem, a grizzled veteran from the War of the Five Kings, rose and said, "I'll take my lads. We've all seen enough life. We'll hold the line long enough for the rest of you to swing around." He was joined by a half-dozen others, each unflinching. They understood that revolution demanded sacrifice. The plan was set. Willem's contingent emerged from the woods, marching in ragged but determined ranks onto the open field. The Lord's Knights saw this as the final confrontation, spurring their horses into a charge. The ground shook beneath pounding hooves. Willem and his group braced spears, their battle cries echoing. The cavalry slammed into them, men and horses toppling in a tangle of steel and flesh. The peasants fought valiantly, but they were outmatched in skill and equipment. Their line buckled under the sheer weight of the assault, yet they did not break. Meanwhile, Gendry, Jon, Tormund, and the bulk of the rebel forces waded the river behind the forest cover, emerging on the knights' flank. Just as the Lord's cavalry began to reform for another charge, horns sounded from the rear. The knights whipped around to see thousands of rebels charging from the riverbank, yelling defiance. Arrows rained down, sowing panic among the horses. The chaos that followed was devastating. Caught between two fronts, the noble host began to crumble. Knights found themselves trapped in swirling melee, their advantage in open ground negated by the pincer. They tried to regroup, but wave after wave of peasants battered them. Gendry focused on breaking the leadership, swinging his hammer at any highborn who stood out, toppling expensive armor and heraldic shields. Jon, in the thick of it, parried blows from men who recognized him, calling him Oathbreaker, traitor to the realm. He responded with swift, measured strikes. Soon, the field was a mass of bodies and wounded men crying out for mercy. The noble standard-bearers toppled under the rebel onslaught. The few who tried to rally were surrounded by furious small folk. The will of the knights began to evaporate. Some lords turned their horses and fled, leaving their men behind. Others dismounted, throwing their swords to the ground. By the time the sun dipped low, the rebel army was in control of the battlefield. The cost was horrendous. Hundreds of peasants lay dead. Willem's contingent was almost entirely gone. But the lords' losses were heavier still, and their aura of invincibility had been shattered. For the first time in Westeros history, a grand host of the nobility had been defeated by a peasant uprising. The scale of it was staggering. Survivors from the Lord's side trickled away, telling horror stories of the unstoppable tide of commoners. In the aftermath, the rebels established a field hospital of sorts, using tents and whatever medical supplies they could gather. Wounded knights lay side by side with wounded peasants, many tended by the same healers. Jon insisted on mercy. These men were no longer an immediate threat, and a new realm, if it were to be just, could not begin with wholesale slaughter. Some in the rebel ranks seethed at the sight, wanting to exact vengeance. Tensions flared, culminating in a few heated disputes. A group of peasants cornered a knight who had once overseen the burning of their village. They were moments from killing him when Gendry physically interposed himself, arms outstretched, reminding them that they had fought to end that kind of cruelty. The night was put under guard instead. Prisoners began to be processed, their names taken, and they were told they would stand before a tribunal of the people. Many shook their heads in disbelief. They could not fathom a world in which peasants held the power to judge them. Some expressed scorn, others defiance, but a surprising number seemed simply lost, uncertain of the future. With the field secured, messengers were sent to spread the news. The revolt had triumphed in a grand battle. The movement was no longer a ragtag gathering by the Trident. It was a force capable of toppling lords. Village by village, town by town, the small folk stirred. Some picked up axes and pitchforks, driving out or capturing local bailiffs and tax collectors. In certain places, lords surrendered without a fight. Better to negotiate terms than face the wrath of an angry, emboldened populace. Soon, the rebels found themselves occupying entire swaths of territory. Their main camp shifted to a more strategic crossroads near the Trident, and they began establishing councils in each region. Representatives traveled from the Westerlands and the Reach, telling tales of how they had overthrown lesser lords or cast them out. They sought recognition from Jon and Gendry, who were increasingly viewed as the guiding force of this revolution. Yet Jon was adamant that they not become the new kings. He insisted each region's council send delegates to a grand assembly. There, they would decide how to unify under a common set of principles, ensuring no single person or house could seize power again. It was a monumental effort. Most of Westeros had never known anything like a democratic assembly. Yet, from blacksmith to baker, everyone had an opinion on how best to govern. Jon found himself inundated with pleas for guidance, from practical issues like crop rotation and water management to philosophical debates on justice and law. He realized he had opened a Pandora's box. Once people believed they could shape their own lives, they wanted to shape every aspect of them. Despite the difficulties, Jon considered it a sign of success. Gendry, ever the smith, recognized the forging of a new order required tempering. He urged patience, cautioning that if they moved too fast, the entire enterprise might collapse into infighting. He saw how local councils might squabble with each other over resources or territorial boundaries. Some folks in the Riverlands wanted no part of the troubles in the Westerlands, and vice versa. Personal grudges occasionally flared up, reminiscent of the old rivalries between houses. Gendry hammered away at these divisions, reminding delegates that they were all one people, standing against centuries of oppression. The lords who had fled regrouped in smaller pockets, launching sporadic raids against rebel-held towns. Not all of the nobility had been crushed in that grand battle, and some even courted outside forces, like sellsword companies from Essos, to attempt to counterstrike. But those efforts lacked unity. The Iron Throne itself, weakened by the prior wars and alliances, was in no position to mount a large-scale offensive. The occupant of the throne, a relatively obscure lord who had maneuvered his way into power after the capital's chaos, found his grip slipping as more and more regions broke away. The Grand Assembly was called at Harrenhal, the largest castle in the Riverlands, infamous for its curses and ill luck. Yet, ironically, its cavernous halls were perfect for housing a massive gathering of delegates. The once feared fortress now stood in partial ruin, still scorched from prior battles, but its main courtyard and great hall remained serviceable. Rebels from all corners of the realm arrived. Men, women, old and young, marched under banners not of noble houses but of local councils, guilds, and free communities. The roads swelled with the traffic of a people who had never before dared to step so boldly onto the stage of power. Jon and Gendry, flanked by Davos, Tormund, and a cadre of leaders, entered Harrenhal's great hall. The space echoed with the sounds of hundreds of voices. The walls loomed overhead, a silent testament to the hubris of the lords who had once feuded for control of the realm. Now, in the place of heraldic pomp, there was a raw energy of popular will. Ghost padded at Jon's side, eliciting gasps from delegates who had never seen a direwolf. Gendry set his hammer down near the dais, an intentional symbol that he brought tools, not just weapons. The assembly commenced with an outpouring of urgent demands, confusion, and fervent speeches. People from the north insisted on their traditions, People from the Stormlands demanded security from future wars. The Iron Islanders wanted freedom to worship the drowned god and manage their own affairs. The Vale delegates, newly arrived, claimed they had overthrown or coerced their local lords to join the cause, but insisted they needed some representation for the knights who had defected to them. The Free Folk, led by Tormund, bluntly declared they wanted no part in any rule that resembled the old ways. They'd come this far only because they trusted Jon Snow. Over the next several days, the delegates hammered out the beginnings of what they called the People's Charter. It was rough, contradictory in places, but revolutionary in spirit. It declared that power lay with the people of Westeros, who would form councils at local, regional, and realm-wide levels to handle governance. No one could be born with the right to rule over others. Property rights, taxes, and justice would be overseen by elected councils. The details were messy, but the broad framework shook the very foundations of the old feudal system. Jon rarely spoke in the general sessions. He tended to watch and listen, stepping in only when disputes threatened to tear the meeting apart. His presence calmed many, as they recalled his fairness in war and peace alike. Gendry participated more actively in debates about the forging of a new system, drawing on his experiences as a commoner from Flea Bottom. He championed fair wages, guild protections for tradesmen, and the need to ensure farmland wasn't monopolized by powerful landlords, who, in this new realm, would be no more than equal citizens if they didn't accept the new rules. Tormund simply boomed that all men and women should be free to live as they choose, as long as they harmed no one else, a surprisingly appealing sentiment for many who had known only servitude. Davos, the most diplomatic, mediated delicate compromises, reminding people that unity was fragile. Not everyone was enamored with this revolution. Some delegates secretly longed for the old days, particularly those who had been minor nobility or local gentry who saw their privileges eroding. Rumors of plots circulated. More than once, suspicious figures were caught lurking around Harrenhal's corridors, possibly spies from lords who still planned a counter-revolt. But for every conspirator uncovered, there were 10 more delegates fully committed to seeing this dream realized. Outside the castle, a sprawling camp of thousands fed on the promise of a new tomorrow. Field kitchens boiled cauldrons of soup, local merchants sold produce and crafts, wandering minstrels played songs celebrating the people's triumph. Families walked among the battered towers of Harrenhal, marveling that they stood in a place once denied to them by centuries of oppression. Children chased each other through courtyards where knights had once jousted, laughing in the sunlight. Amid that hopeful scene, Jon often found moments of quiet reflection. He would climb onto a portion of the ruined battlements, looking out over the miles of farmland and forest. He remembered the cynicism he'd felt after the wars, how it had seemed no matter who sat the Iron Throne, the realm would never truly know peace or justice. But seeing these families, these newly empowered commoners forging their own destiny, rekindled a spark of hope. The cost had been terrible, with thousands dead, but if something good and lasting arose from that sacrifice, perhaps it was worth it. One afternoon, after the delegates had bickered for hours over land distribution, Gendry came to find Jon perched on a fallen gargoyle overlooking the parapets. The young Smith-turned leader looked weary, dark circles under his eyes. He took a seat beside Jon. They exchanged a long, comfortable silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Then Gendry spoke softly. "Do you think we're doing the right thing? Or are we just damned to repeat the same mistakes? Different coats of paint?" Jon's gaze remained on the horizon. "I've asked myself that 1,000 times. We might fail, Gendry. The lords who remain might wage war for years. The new councils might collapse into feuds. There's no guarantee." Gendry sighed, nodding. "Aye, but at least we're giving the people the choice for once. It's something Robert or any other king never did." Jon turned his head, gray eyes meeting Gendry's. "My father, my true father, never had the chance to grant that either. We've both seen what unchecked power does. We might not have all the answers, but we know we can't keep living under the old order." They lapsed back into silence, joined only by the wind. Perhaps both of them were remembering that boy from the burned village, or the horrors of warfare they'd witnessed. Perhaps they were remembering the promises they'd made to themselves and to the people who followed them. Below, in the castle courtyard, the delegates finally emerged from the great hall, many looking haggard but grimly satisfied. News spread through the camp that the assembly had reached a landmark agreement on core principles, including a system by which local councils would send representatives to a central council, what some were already calling a parliament of the people. Summons would be sent across the realm, inviting any region that wished to join. Those that declined would be left alone, unless they attempted to oppress or attack neighboring peoples. In the days that followed, the delegates drafted the basic procedures, elections by the adult population, the idea that each region's representation would be roughly proportional to its number of villages or towns, and a system for removing representatives who proved corrupt. They decreed that no one could hold a position for more than a set term to prevent the rise of new dynasties. These concepts were radical, and many details were left to be fleshed out, but a framework existed at last. Messages were sent via raven or courier to every corner of Westeros, inviting them to join this new confederation. Some responded with enthusiasm. Villages and towns that had cast off their lords were eager to be part of something bigger. Some noble houses trembled, uncertain if they should capitulate or stand firm. A few declared open hostility, but they were increasingly isolated. As Harrenhal transitioned from hosting a mere assembly to becoming a central seat of this new confederation, Jon and Gendry recognized that the real work was only beginning. Building a new realm required more than a charter. It required men and women of integrity in leadership positions, a fair system of laws, and a means to defend against external threats. Yet for the first time, these monumental tasks belonged to the many, not the few. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, Jon found himself in a corner of Harrenhal's library, a surprisingly intact chamber with shelves half filled with old tomes. Dust motes swirled in the lantern light. He thumbed through a tattered volume on the history of the Night's Watch, reflecting on the vows he had once taken to shield the realms of men. He realized that vow took on a new meaning now, shielding men from the tyranny of those who once claimed dominion. Gendry entered quietly, setting his hammer aside. In his hand, he carried a small piece of parchment with fresh ink. "They're calling for us to stand before the assembly tomorrow," he said. "They want us to accept or reject official positions as heads of the Central Council." Jon shook his head slowly, heart heavy with the memory of how the North had crowned him once before. "You know my answer, Gendry. I don't want crowns or titles. We've come too far to set up new kings." Gendry exhaled, raking a hand through his dark hair. I feel the same, but maybe for a short time they just need some direction. We can't let it fall into chaos. If we refuse, we risk leaving a power vacuum. Some opportunists could step in, claim they speak for the people, and create a new tyranny. Jon frowned, his mind roiling with possibilities. "We can guide them. We can serve as watchers, but not rulers. Maybe that's enough for a year or two. Let them form the councils, strengthen the institutions. After that, we step aside." Gendry nodded, lips curving into a faint smile. "All right, we'll be caretakers, guardians of the realm, helping them build the new order. But no kneeling, no kingship, no iron throne. That's done." They gripped each other's forearms in a silent vow. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant laughter from the camps, where ordinary folk celebrated the dawn of a new age. The next day, in the Great Hall, a hush fell over the assembled delegates as Jon Snow and Gendry stepped forward. Rows of men and women, once peasants and commoners, now the de facto architects of Westeros' future, looked on with anticipation. Davos stood by, a kind but firm expression on his lined face. Tormund was there as well, arms folded, curious to see how this southern custom played out. A delegate from the Riverlands, an older woman named Marta who had been a washerwoman before the Revolt, called the assembly to order. In a voice that trembled with emotion, she announced, "We, the free people of Westeros, have convened here to decide our fate. We ask that Jon Snow and Gendry Baratheon stand as interim protectors of our confederation, guiding us through this time of transition, ensuring our councils are not undermined by those who would seize power for themselves." The hall erupted in applause and cheers. Jon raised his hands for silence, and the crowd quieted. He spoke, voice resonating across the vaulted space. "My friends, I stand before you not as your king, but as a man who has seen what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of one. I have fought for the living before, and I do so now in a different way. I accept the role of protector to defend your right to choose your own leaders, but I will not be a ruler. The moment this confederation stands on its own, I will step aside." Gendry moved forward, hammer resting on the floor beside him. "I come from Flea Bottom. I was told my life mattered less than the dogs in the street. I never imagined standing here, in Harrenhal, with all of you, but this cause has shown me that any man or woman can rise up, forge a new path. I'll gladly stand as a protector, no crowns, no lords, until these councils are strong enough to keep any tyrant from ever rising again." The applause this time thundered off the walls. Marta formally asked if the assembly agreed. A roar of assent nearly shook the stones of Harrenhal. Thus, Jon Snow and Gendry Baratheon were named protectors of the People's Confederation of Westeros, an office neither had sought but both accepted out of duty. In the weeks and months that followed, the Confederation slowly took shape. Regional councils sent permanent representatives to Harrenhal, ensuring every free community had a voice. Taxation, once a dreaded instrument of oppression, became a system of shared contribution, used to maintain roads, settle disputes, and fund defenses against external threats. Those lords who remained intransigent found themselves isolated, their peasants fleeing or rising up. Some eventually sought negotiations, trying to integrate peacefully into the Confederation system. At times, the Confederation quaked with internal disputes. Lines of commerce needed to be reestablished, and the distribution of farmland was a thorny issue, especially in areas where lords had held large estates. But each challenge was met through debate, compromise, and sometimes the direct mediation of Jon or Gendry. Slowly, a new social fabric began to weave itself, frayed at the edges but stronger at the core. As the Confederation stabilized, Jon often visited the old Godswood at Harrenhal, where a lone weirwood clung to life despite the castle's cursed reputation. He knelt there in quiet reflection, sometimes with Ghost at his side, remembering those who had fought and died for the realm. Ned Stark, Robb, the Night's Watch brothers. He prayed that wherever their spirits roamed, they might see that a better world was finally struggling to be born. And Gendry, when not engaged in official duties, returned to his smithy. He insisted on building a forge in one of Harrenhal's less ruined outbuildings, and there he could be found in the evenings, soot smudged on his face, forging horseshoes, nails, and occasionally a new sword or hammer. He said it reminded him of who he truly was. Not a lord or a king, but a smith who strove to create something enduring out of raw metal. So it was that the two unlikely allies, Jon Snow, once a bastard of Winterfell and reluctant king in the north, and Gendry, bastard of King Robert Baratheon, led a revolt that transformed Westeros. Their story spread across the realm, and even across the narrow sea, where curious travelers and merchants spoke of a land unshackled by aristocracy. In Bravos, some whispered that this confederation echoed the ideals of the free cities. Others dismissed it as a short-lived experiment doomed to fail. But in Westeros itself, the people lived the change day by day, forging and tempering a new society that rested not on the whims of lords, but on the collective will of the common folk. It was not a perfect ending. The Confederation would face challenges, external and internal. Old hatreds did not vanish overnight, and winter would come again someday. But in that moment, on those plains and in those towers where once only feudal might had reigned, the voices of ordinary people rose in councils, shaping their own destiny. And Jon Snow and Gendry Baratheon stood vigil as protectors, not kings, determined to safeguard what they had helped create until it could stand without them. A realm reborn, in which no one man or woman was born to rule, and no child would ever again be beaten or starved for the sake of a lord's pride. For at least a generation, the dream of common rule lit the nights of Westeros like distant, unwavering stars, shining a promise that, for the first time, all were free to look up and believe they could hold a piece of that light in their own hands. In the weeks following the formation of the People's Confederation at Harrenhal, The vast halls and crumbling ramparts of that cursed fortress bustled with an energy no one had seen there in generations. Where once lords had warred, conspired, or feared the infamous curse of Harrenhal, now craftsmen rebuilt broken walls, farmers tilled small plots within the outer courtyards, and delegates argued passionately in makeshift council chambers. The Confederation had pledged that no single house or ruler would dominate Westeros. Yet to make that pledge reality, they had to face countless obstacles that threatened to tear their fragile unity apart. Jon Snow and Gendry Baratheon, named protectors by unanimous acclamation, watched as each challenge surfaced. From the vantage of a partially collapsed watchtower, Jon and Ghost often overlooked the sprawl of tents clustered outside Harrenhal's gates. Thousands of families had made the journey to see this new order for themselves. Some came to petition the councils for redress of old wrongs. Others came seeking refuge from lords still clinging to their ancestral domains. Merchants set up rows of stalls along the old roads that led to the castle, hawking salted fish from the Trident, bread, ale, or occasionally more exotic fare from the far corners of the continent. And from time to time, suspicious figures lurked among the crowds, men or women loyal to noble houses that refused to accept peasant rule. Each morning, Gendry rose early, forging nails and mending tools in a newly established smithy on the south side of Harrenhal's yard. His hammer rang out as a steady heartbeat of industry, and folk lined up to request horseshoes, hinges, or pikeheads. Seeing the protector of the Confederation so plainly at work reminded them that their leaders were not aloof or arrogant. They labored side by side with the people. Gendry was not a silver-tongued politician, but he held an earnest respect for those who came to him for help. Often, he'd exchange a quick grin, pass over the newly formed tool, and ask for no coin in return, only a vow to support the Confederation that was trying so hard to shelter them all. Not all embraced this new order with the same fervor. Tensions simmered, especially in regions where lords had not been overthrown by outright revolt or had found ways to negotiate partial deals with the local councils. Under the Confederation's charter, each region was meant to select delegates, men and women who represented the people. But in certain lands, smaller houses cleverly manipulated these elections, using intimidation or ancient ties of fealty to push their own cronies into delegate seats. Others withheld their harvests, refusing to send grain to the Confederation's central stores unless guaranteed favorable treatment. Jon kept a running list of issues pinned to a board in the old castle's library. Farmland disputes in the Reach, rumors that a cluster of lords along the Blackwater Bay was mustering sellsword companies, complaints from the Westerlands that traveling caravans faced violence at the hands of brigands. Each item represented a fault line that could fracture the Confederation. He met with Davos Seaworth, Tormund Giantsbane, and the newly formed Provisional Central Council to tackle these problems one by one. They learned, in short order, that administrating a large realm was infinitely more complex when the power was dispersed. It required near-constant consensus, delicate balancing of local interests, and a willingness to compromise without giving up the foundational ideals of the revolt. One day might bring a haggard group of farmers from the northern edges of the Riverlands, complaining that their local council had seized part of their land for communal projects, leaving them with insufficient fields for their own families. The next, a delegation from the Vale might arrive, insisting that the protective watch around the Bloody Gate remain in their own hands for fear of infiltration by rogue lords. Jon and Gendry spent many late nights in the old reading room with representatives from a half-dozen regional councils, trying to codify basic laws. The delegates argued about how to handle property claims, stolen livestock, or the forging of new charters for towns. Everyone seemed to realize they were forging laws not just for one generation, but for a realm that had never known anything other than top-down aristocratic rule. And if they failed, the entire experiment would collapse into chaos, or worse, revert to a single tyrant claiming absolute control. In the midst of these daunting administrative tasks, the Confederation faced its first crisis that did not come from the old nobility, but from within. A band of armed peasants, calling themselves the Blood Tithe, began traveling from village to village, capturing minor lords or landholders who had once participated in any oppression, and executing them without trial. The Blood Tithe claimed they were purging the realm of the leeches, who had grown rich and powerful off commoners' backs. Their methods were brutal. Hangings, beheadings, even public burnings. Whispers of these vigilante atrocities spread rapidly, and some delegates began to fear that if the Confederation failed to rein them in, local councils would lose credibility or be forced to replicate such violence in a savage race to prove their revolutionary zeal. Jon heard about the blood tithe from a trembling boy who stumbled into Harrenhal's courtyard one morning. The boy's clothes were torn, his face smudged with soot. He recounted how the group had arrived at his village, demanding to know which peasants still paid homage to the local lordling. Accusations flew, some villagers pointed fingers at neighbors in old feuds, and by nightfall a dozen men, some perhaps guilty, some perhaps innocent, had been strung up in the village square. The boy begged the Confederation for help. That same evening, a small council convened in the battered remains of Harrenhal's great hall, with torchlight dancing along the scarred stone columns. Jon stood beside Gendry, Tormund, and Davos, addressing the delegates who sat on wooden benches arranged in a rough circle. The boy told his story again, voice catching at times as he relived the horror. Shock and anger rippled through the assembly. Some delegates insisted that the blood tithe had to be crushed. Others argued that the tithe, while extreme, was the natural response to centuries of exploitation. Justice, after all, had been slow or non-existent under old lords. Gendry's voice eventually cut through the argument. "We fought to end tyranny," he said, hammering his fist on the arm of his chair, "not to replace it with a mob that kills without due process. If we allow this, we're no better than the lords who once burned villages. If a man is guilty of a crime, we judge him fairly. If he's innocent, we don't kill him just for being called Lord." Tormund, leaning forward with his usual bluntness, rumbled, "We free folk be dealt with vengeance and blood feuds enough. Takes a strong hand to stop it. You want to call yourselves a new realm? Show the people you won't tolerate murdering for the sake of it." Jon nodded. "We must intervene, but carefully. If we merely attack them, we risk fueling more violence. These people believe they're delivering justice. We need to show them there's a better way. That's why we established our tribunals." Thus, a plan was formed to send a peacekeeping force into the region, accompanied by a tribunal of delegates from different councils. Jon volunteered to lead the expedition personally. Gendry opted to stay behind, ensuring that Harrenhal's governance did not falter in his absence. Tormund offered to join Jon, along with a score of veterans who had fought in the revolt and knew how to handle themselves if negotiations soured. They left at dawn, riding on horseback with supply wagons and a small retinue of healers in tow. The boy guided them to the outskirts of his village, where the blood tithe's presence still weighed heavily. During the journey, Jon could not help but recall another time he had ridden to quell chaos. A time when he was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, trying to balance the demands of men who refused to see the bigger picture. This new realm was not so different. People's fears and angers ran deep. Changing the structures of power did not erase old wounds. They arrived at the village just after midday. Smoke curled from chimney pots, and a tense hush gripped the muddy lanes. A ring of men, armed with pitchforks, spears, and some stolen swords, guarded the central square. Roughly scrawled banners, red handprints, hung from poles. In the middle of the square, a gruesome sight, an old gallows with rotting corpses still swaying. Jon reined in his horse and signaled for his group to halt. Tormund squinted at the men in the square, scowling. The watchers bristled, uncertain whether to fight or parley. One man stepped forward, ragged clothes stained with dried blood. His eyes blazed with zeal. "You come from Harrenhal?" he demanded. "Here to tell us we're criminals? We do the work you won't. The work that must be done. Lords have ground us under their boots for centuries. Why do you defend them?" Jon dismounted, lifting both hands to show he held no weapon. Ghost prowled silently at his side, hackles half raised. "I defend justice," Jon said in a measured tone. "You can't bring peace to Westeros with hangings and cruelty. We rose up to end that." The man spat on the ground. "You say that, but we see lords walk free. We see them keep their fancy keeps, even if you call them equal citizens. Some of them keep their gold. Where's the justice in that? A cluster of villagers had gathered, peering from behind shuttered windows and doorways. Tormund let out a low grunt. He did not relish talk. He would much rather brandish an axe than debate. But he held his place, trusting Jon's approach. Jon breathed deeply. "We've set up tribunals for those who committed crimes against the people," he said. "Lord Byrell was captured and is awaiting trial. Others will face the same. You talk about justice, but what you're doing is vengeance. Vengeance kills innocence along with the guilty. We want a realm where no one is above the law. That means no lords, but no murderous mobs either." The man from the blood tithe narrowed his eyes. "You're Jon Snow, aren't you? The one who was king in the north, then bent the knee to the Dragon Queen. The one who helped overthrow another queen in the capital. How many died in that war? Tell me, did you not kill men too?" Jon's mouth felt dry. "I killed when I had no choice. I killed to defend the realm from threats. First the dead, then the tyrants. But we offered mercy where we could." Laughter, bitter and raw, escaped the man's lips. "Mercy for those who torched our homes?" He gestured wildly toward the gallows. "That lord up there oversaw a dozen floggings. He cut off the hand of a boy who stole a loaf of bread. He was never going to get his just deserts from some council, so we gave it to him." Behind him, half a dozen men in the tithe's circle nodded grimly. Others shifted uncertainly, glancing at the new arrivals. The tension was thick. Then a woman broke from the ring, a middle-aged villager with a tear-stained face. "You say you gave him justice," she cried. "But you also took my husband's life. He never harmed anyone. He only once paid a tithe to that lord under duress, and for that you called him a collaborator. You butchered him." The man flinched, his jaw working in frustration. Jon seized the moment. "Look around you," he said, letting his voice rise. "You say you fight for the people, yet the people fear you. That's not freedom. That's another brand of tyranny. I won't stand aside and let you continue." Tormund stepped forward, hefting his axe onto his shoulder in a silent show of readiness. The other members of Jon's party spread out slightly, though none drew weapons yet. The blood tithe's leader flicked his gaze around, evaluating the odds. He snorted. "So be it. We're not so many, but we'll die before bowing to false justice." Before weapons could clash, a voice shouted from behind the tithe's circle, "Stop!" Davos Seaworth, who had trailed behind Jon's main group to speak with the villagers, came hurrying through the square. The old smuggler was winded, but he raised both hands. "You can't keep doing this. Even if your cause started righteous, you're harming the very folk you claim to protect." An uneasy hush descended. Jon recognized that no single conversation could unravel such deep wrath, but he also knew violence would only stoke it further. He gestured to the armed men. "Lay down your weapons. Come with us to Harrenhal. Present your grievances before the councils. If you are right, if your claims are just, the people will hear them. If you've committed crimes, you'll answer for them. But at least you'll get a fair hearing. No more killing. No more terrorizing villages." The tithe's leader sneered. "As if we could trust the councils. Most delegates are still small folk, but they're swayed by men like you and Gendry. In the end, it's always the same story. The peasants get sold out for the sake of peace." Jon leveled a steady gaze at him. "We're forging a world where that is not the story anymore. But if you refuse to stop, we will stop you." For a moment, it seemed the man might order an attack. The ring of tithe members closed ranks, tension etched in their faces. Then one of them, a younger man with haunted eyes, let his spear drop to the ground. Another followed suit. They cast apprehensive looks at each other, uncertain. The leader swore under his breath. His convictions were absolute, but he was losing the backing of his men. The villagers who watched appeared fearful yet desperate for an end to the bloodshed. Eventually, the leader flung his sword into the dirt. "Fine. We'll go," he spat. "If only to show the councils how useless they are. Let them try us." Jon suppressed a sigh of relief. Even Tormund seemed mildly impressed that this confrontation had ended without a single blow. Under the watchful eyes of the Confederation Guard, the Blood Tithe surrendered their arms. Villagers gathered, weeping or murmuring in disbelief. They had expected a slaughter one side or the other. Instead, the Revolution's protectors showed a glimpse of what justice might be. Not the old lord's justice, nor the savage vengeance of a mob, but something in between. They marched the tithe members to Harrenhal, where a tribunal convened, composed of delegates from multiple regions, none of whom had direct personal entanglements with the men on trial. The process was slow, chaotic, and the tithe's leader launched into a speech about the sins of the nobility at every turn. Dozens of villagers came forward to testify, some in support of the tithe's motivations, others condemning their actions. In the end, the tribunal found them guilty of extrajudicial killings and sentenced them to years of forced labor, rebuilding roads and fortifications across the realm. They were not executed, nor were they pardoned. It was a precarious balance. Though the trial lasted only a few days, it set a vital precedent. No person, no matter how justified they felt, could commit murder under the banner of revolutionary justice. For many in the Confederation, it was a sign that the new order was serious about upholding the principle that no one stood above law, be they a lord, a king, or even a vengeful peasant. Not all were pleased. Some radicals claimed Jon and Gendry were growing soft or becoming elitist. But the majority realized that if they condoned such violence, Westeros would descend into endless cycles of revenge, undermining everything they had fought for. Word of the tribunal's verdict spread through the realm, lending a sense of cautious stability to Confederation territories. Villages that had flirted with joining extremist factions pulled back, while others looked upon Harrenhal's councils as a legitimate arbiter. Meanwhile, the once intransigent lords realized that Jon and Gendry were not just charismatic figureheads. They had a system, messy though it was, that people were beginning to trust. Still, the realm was vast, and trouble brewed in corners beyond the Confederation's immediate grasp. In the north, some of the old northern houses, battered by the wars against the dead and the subsequent conflict, had supported Jon out of loyalty to the Starks. Yet rumors suggested not all were content with the idea of bowing to a people's council in Harrenhal. A cluster of minor northern lords, led by Lord Karstark, had begun calling for a purely northern government, separate from the Confederation. They argued that the North had always been semi-autonomous and should remain so, Starks or no Starks. To the Iron Islands, the Confederation was an object of scorn. Word had it that one of the surviving Greyjoys, a distant cousin of the late Balon, was stirring up the Ironborn with promises of renewed raiding. "The mainland is weak," he proclaimed. "They've replaced kings with peasants, and peasants are easier to plunder." Several small villages along the western coast reported sudden attacks at night, longships appearing without warning, stealing livestock and supplies, and vanishing before any local militia could respond. In Dorne, meanwhile, the fractious principalities had long been accustomed to more egalitarian customs compared to other parts of Westeros, but they still maintained the institution of ruling houses. Some Dornish lords considered the Confederation's ideals appealing, particularly those who had lost favor in earlier regime changes. Others scoffed, confident that their own unique laws and traditions already gave their small folk more rights than anywhere else. These lords sought no subordination to a confederation outside their borders. Amid these challenges, an even more pressing concern arose. Winter. The decades-long summer had ended with the Great War against the dead. Now the seasons turned more quickly toward a harsh chill. Though not the full, bitter winter known in the darkest tales, the temperature was dropping, and the Confederation had to ensure that tens of thousands of newly liberated people did not starve. Fields had been ravaged by wars and neglect. Seed stocks were low in many regions. Stockpiling for the cold months required a level of coordination that the old monarchy had sometimes provided, through forced taxes and levies. But the Confederation's approach, reliant on voluntary cooperation, threatened to be slow and patchy. Gendry spearheaded a plan to revitalize farmland around major rivers, especially the Trident. He gathered blacksmiths, carpenters, and laborers to repair old irrigation systems. The councils issued calls for farmers to work collective fields, offering them shares of the harvest in return. It was an enormous undertaking, requiring both resources and goodwill. Even so, as the first frosts approached, it became clear that certain areas, especially the war-torn crownlands, risked severe shortages. Pleas for grain flooded Harrenhal's halls. One chilly evening, as a biting wind howled through the castle's broken towers, Jon paced in a small office that had once been a storeroom. A newly drawn map of Westeros was spread on a crude table, pinned with markers to indicate where food supplies were stored. Ghost lay by the door, ears perked, occasionally whining when Jon wore down the floor with his restless steps. Davos stood on the opposite side of the table, arms folded in concern. "We've redistributed what we can," he said, "but without a unified system of roads and safe convoys, the grain caravans can't get where they're needed most. Raiders, outlaws, and remaining pockets of loyalist lords threaten them." Jon exhaled slowly. "We'll need to secure those trade routes, but that means pulling fighters away from potential hotspots. The Iron Islanders raids will only get worse if they sense we've shifted our defenses inland. Meanwhile, the North's lords might take our diversion as a sign of weakness." Davos pursed his lips. "Might be we'll have to rely on local councils building their own militias to protect food shipments. The Confederation can't do it all. That's the point of a decentralized structure, I reckon. But it's risky. Some militias are barely trained." Before Jon could respond, Gendry arrived with an armful of parchment. He set them down, rubbed his sooty hands on his vest, and nodded at Davos. "We've had a proposal from the Riverlands Council. They want to start a people's militia registry, like we used to have petty lords raise levies, but now each council organizes volunteers. They register them with the Central Confederation, ensuring they're not just roving bands of armed men. Could keep order more effectively than waiting on us." Jon glanced at the stack of parchment. "It's a good idea in principle, but will these militias truly follow the Confederation's guidelines, or turn into petty armies loyal to whoever leads them locally?" Gendry shrugged. "We can't be everywhere at once. The best we can do is set a standard. Militias must answer to elected councils, not to a single leader. They must agree to abide by Confederation law. Any rogue militia that acts outside these rules is disbanded. The Riverlands folks think they can make it work." Jon nodded. "Let's push it through. If it helps protect the caravans and keep order, we need it. Winter's at our doorstep. If entire villages starve, we'll face rebellions again by spring, just for a different reason." And so it happened that, in the following weeks, the People's Militia Registry took shape across the Confederation-held lands. Councils gathered villagers willing to bear arms in defense of trade routes and farmland. The newly appointed Confederation scribes traveled from region to region, recording names, distributing simple uniforms, nothing more than cloth tabards dyed a uniform color, and explaining the basic regulations for engagement. There were stumbles, of course. Some councils tried to withhold recruits for fear of losing valuable farmhands. Others worried that armaments might end up in the hands of criminals. But slowly, a network of decentralized militias formed, knit together by shared interest in the Confederation's survival. When the caravans began rolling out of the Riverlands, loaded with sacks of grain and root vegetables, the militias fanned out, standing guard along roads once prowled by bandits. A few skirmishes erupted. Small pockets of loyalist knights or hedge knights tried to seize the supplies. In one notable incident, near a place called Millcross, a militia band fought off a group of horsemen that wore no clear sigil but were rumored to be in the pay of certain Crownlands lords. The peasants, newly armed with crossbows, took the horsemen by surprise and routed them, sending a clear message that the Confederation was no longer easy prey. Despite these victories, winter's breath was cold. The last leaves fell from the trees, leaving a skeletal forest around Harrenhal. Snow dusted the castle ramparts on an early morning, prompting anxious murmurs about how harsh the season might become. Yet, in the gloom of gathering cold, something unexpected arrived. A raven from Winterfell. Jon carefully unrolled the parchment in his quarters, a solitary candle flickering. It bore the seal of House Karstark but was written in a formal, measured tone, a request for a meeting. The letter stated that Lord Karstark, who had been rumored to lead those northern lords resistant to Confederation rule, wished to speak on matters of mutual interest and a possible arrangement. Jon read it twice, uncertain what had caused the man to reach out now. Perhaps fear of the oncoming winter, or recognition that the Confederation was gaining legitimacy. The letter also hinted at support from other northern houses. "They do not all share your dream," the letter concluded, "but they do not desire more strife. We are prepared to discuss terms." Gendry came in mid-reading. Jon passed him the letter. Gendry's brow furrowed as he scanned the words. "The North was always proud," he said quietly. "You think they'll come around to the Confederation?" Jon folded the letter. "I don't know. But if we can reach a peaceful compromise, something that keeps the North in the fold, we should try. If the North breaks away, more regions might follow. Next thing you know, we're back to 7 kingdoms or 8 or 9, each vying for dominance. That's exactly what we wanted to end." So Jon prepared to travel north. He took a small retinue, including Tormund, who was all too happy to visit the colder climes, and a few delegates from the new Central Council. Davos stayed behind to help Gendry. Before departing, Jon spent a moment in the Godswood of Harrenhal, kneeling at the ancient weirwood. He thought of his father, both Ned Stark and the secret father, Rhaegar Targaryen. He thought of the northern traditions he had once embodied as king in the north. Now he was no king, merely a protector in a government of free councils. If the old northern houses wanted a monarch to rally behind, he could not be that man. But maybe they didn't. Maybe they just wanted reassurance that their ways would be respected. They set out on horseback in the swirling gray dawn. The roads were bitter, half-frozen ruts, though not yet covered in deep drifts. They traveled through the riverlands, where many recognized Jon and shouted greetings. Gendry's name also came up often, as the blacksmith-turned-protector had a knack for inspiring folk to believe in the Confederation's basic fairness. Tormund joked that Gendry was more popular than half the old kings combined, simply because he made good nails and told no lies. Crossing the neck proved slow and tedious, the causeways slick with ice. Reeds stood frozen in the bogs, and occasional bursts of chill wind carried the lonely cry of a marsh bird. The crannogmen they encountered were wary but not unfriendly, having seen enough turmoil to last a lifetime. They made no fuss about the Confederation's form of government, living as they always had, answerable to few. North of Moat Cailin, the landscape turned starker, the wind sharper. Snow blew across the track, forcing them to stop early some days to find shelter. Wolves howled at night, and Tormund often responded with eerie howls of his own, grinning at Jon's exasperated glance. The small group was reminded that this was a land shaped by winter and ancient traditions. Would these clans and lords truly bend to a new way of rule, or cling to the old feudal ties that had united them under House Stark for centuries? They reached Winterfell to find it changed, and yet, in many ways, the same. The outer walls loomed against the whitened sky. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and the warmth of the castle's natural hot springs gave the courtyard a faint steam. Guards bearing the Karstark sigil stood by the gate, along with others from lesser northern houses. No single banner of House Stark flew overhead, which tugged at Jon's heart. The old gray direwolf standard was nowhere to be seen, as Sansa's rule had ended with the settlement of the last war, and the seat had fallen into a caretaker's hands after the northern campaigns. Now it seemed that caretaker was Lord Karstark or some coalition under him. They were escorted inside with cautious courtesy. Tormund sniffed the air, remarking loudly that the place smelled of wet dog and stew. Like a proper keep at least. One of the Karstark guards frowned, but said nothing. Lord Karstark awaited them in the great hall. The sight of it brought back a flood of memories for Jon. The high rafters, the long tables, the sense that this was once his home. Yet, the sigils along the walls were mostly white sons of Karstark, interspersed with the sigils of a few other northern houses that had gathered for the meeting. The dire wolf of House Stark was represented only by a single, tattered banner near the dais, symbolic, perhaps, of the uncertain future. Karstark rose as they entered. He was a tall, hawk-faced man, with iron-gray hair pulled back from a high forehead. Jon remembered him from a distant time, though they had never been close. Karstark gestured for them to sit at a central table, where a mild feast had been laid. Roast pork, boiled vegetables, and bread. The northern custom of hospitality, it seemed, was still intact. Once they were seated, Karstark made a perfunctory attempt at politeness. "Jon Snow, welcome back to Winterfell. We have not seen you in some time. It was said you journeyed beyond the wall after the Great War." Jon inclined his head. "I did for a while. Then I returned to help end a different war." He glanced around the hall. "I see you've been busy as well." Karstark's eyes flicked to Tormund, whose broad grin seemed to unnerve some of the assembled northern lords. "Yes," Karstark said. "We've tried to keep the North together after so many losses. The name Stark still carries weight, but we needed leadership. As you must know, we have not fully embraced your revolution." Jon met his gaze evenly. "I'm aware. That's why I came. You wrote that you wanted to discuss arrangements." Karstark nodded. He drank from a horn of ale, then set it down, his tone turning more direct. "The North is a proud land, Jon Snow. We've fought and bled to keep our traditions. We've never fully submitted to Southern rule. House Stark, your house, led us well enough. But now the Confederation claims that all houses are dissolved, that the people should rule themselves. We have no desire to be subject to a council of Riverlanders, Crownlanders, or anyone else." Another man, Lord Serwyn, interjected. "We aren't blind to the changes. We hear you've toppled lords who abused their small folk. That's all well and good for the South. Here in the North we handle our own. We have for thousands of years." Tormund released a hearty laugh that echoed in the rafters. "You lot handle your own, do you? Yet every time something big happens you call on your neighbors or the Night's Watch or the King in the North. If you were truly independent, you'd have never crowned a Stark. You'd live in your own tiny fiefs, squabbling among yourselves." A few northern lords bristled at the wildling's scorn. Karstark raised a hand for silence, though his eyes narrowed. "And you, Tormund Giantsbane, are you the mouthpiece for this confederation too?" Tormund shrugged. "I speak for myself, which is the way it should be. The rest is up to you. But if you want to pretend you're better off alone, just remember the nights are long, and winter kills the hungry. You might need the South's grain before long." Karstark exhaled heavily, glancing at Jon. "We don't want famine, nor do we want war. Our proposition is this: the North remains free to govern itself under the old forms. We have our lords and heads of houses, but we agree to maintain open trade with the Confederation, accept certain standards of fair treatment for small folk, and promise not to wage war on Confederation lands. In return, the Confederation treats us as a sovereign ally, not a subject. That means no meddling in who holds what keep, no forced dissolution of northern houses." Jon considered these words. This arrangement sounded like the North was effectively seceding from the Confederation, except for a trade alliance. The spirit of the revolution demanded that no one be born to rule over others. Could the Confederation accept a chunk of territory that insisted on maintaining lords and ladies? Would that betrayal of principle cause friction among the councils? He spoke after a thoughtful silence. "I won't lie, this goes against the Confederation's fundamental stance. We abolished hereditary rule, but we also value peace, and we know the North has its own ways. If we can craft an agreement that guarantees the rights of small folk in the North, ensures they have representation, and outlaws the worst abuses of feudal power, perhaps there's a middle ground." Karstark's lips tightened. "A middle ground, yes, but we will not hold elections in the same manner you do. Nor will we have our lords stand trial before a southern tribunal. What happens in the North stays in the North, unless we break the terms of the alliance." Jon glanced at Tormund, who gave a small shrug. Then he nodded slowly. "Let us discuss specifics. Maybe we can find a compromise." The negotiations lasted late into the night. They retreated from the great hall to a smaller solar, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Plates of half-eaten food lay scattered across side tables, and the men drank spiced wine to keep warm. The conversation was heated, with Tormund frequently chiding the stubborn crows for refusing to see the future, and Karstark turning red with anger at times. Jon remained calm, focusing on the key points. The Confederation needed stable trade routes in and out of the North. The North needed recognition that it could maintain local customs. Above all, Jon insisted on including a clause that guaranteed small folk the right to petition the Confederation if they suffered gross injustice at the hands of a northern lord. At first, Karstark scoffed at the notion, claiming it would undermine northern autonomy. But Jon pushed, quietly reminding him that the Confederation had enough clout, through its militias and alliances, to isolate the North if it turned a blind eye to atrocities. He also invoked the memory of Ned Stark's sense of justice. Ned always believed in protecting the lowliest shepherd, even if it meant calling a lord to account. That made some of the older Northerners pause, remembering the man they had once followed. By dawn, the outline of a treaty had formed. It fell short of full Confederation membership, but it was an alliance that allowed for mutual trade, mutual defense if external threats arose, and a minimal guarantee of rights for Northern commoners, enforceable through a joint Northern Confederation tribunal process that would only be invoked in extreme cases. The Northern Lords retained their titles, albeit with an understanding that the Confederation did not formally recognize inherited authority, only recognized the North's right to self-govern as a partner. It was a kludge, a careful dance around the core disagreements, but it might avert conflict. Jon read the final draft, mind numb from exhaustion. Karstark eyed him. "Will your Confederation accept this? Or will we see armies march north if they refuse?" Jon shook his head. "If they refuse, I'll do my best to negotiate further. We want no more armies. Let's hope it doesn't come to that." They sealed the agreement in a subdued ceremony. No lavish feast or cheering crowds. Simply a handshake and the official stamping of the Confederation's new sigil. A 7-pointed star recast into an emblem of the people. Some said it was a nod to the old faith of the Seven, but shaped differently to represent common folk. Karstark offered to house Jon and his companions for a week, but Jon declined, needing to return south before the roads became impassable. He was still uncertain how Gendry and the Central Councils would receive this half-measure. Before departing Winterfell, Jon slipped away to the crypts beneath the castle. He carried a lantern, the flame guttering in the chill draft. The stone steps felt familiar under his boots, each echo carrying him back to childhood. Down below, the statues of Stark's long dead lined the corridors, gray watchers of the North's unyielding history. At one alcove, he found Ned Stark's resting place, and his chest tightened with unspoken emotion. He remembered kneeling there as a boy, wondering about his own parentage. Now he was a man grown, no longer a bastard in name, but a man with far more complicated truths swirling behind him. He knelt again as he had so many times before. "Father," he murmured to the silent statue. "I'm trying to do what's right, but everything is complicated. We're changing the realm, but the North clings to the old ways. I don't know if that's truly best for the people who live here, yet I can't force them, or I become the tyrant we overthrew." His voice echoed softly. The empty crypts gave no answer, except the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Still, Jon felt a familiar warmth, as though the quiet presence of his father lingered, urging him to trust in his instincts. After a few more moments, he rose, turned, and began the climb back to the surface. The wind outside awaited him, along with Tormund's easy jests, the stares of the Northern Lords, and the uncertain path south. Their return trek was faster. Winter's grip tightened, but with fewer stops, they covered the distance in decent time. News of their treaty preceded them via Raven. By the time Jon reached Harrenhal, Gendry was waiting in the main courtyard, arms folded, face unreadable. The castle bustled as always, but a hush seemed to fall as the two protectors locked eyes. Jon dismounted, rubbing warmth into his gloved hands. "We have an arrangement," he said, handing Gendry the official parchment. "It's not perfect. The North wants to remain partly outside our system, but they'll cooperate on trade and defense, and they'll accept a minimal condition that small folk can appeal for help if lords grow too abusive." Gendry took a long moment reading the document, expression neutral. Delegates who hovered nearby, curious about the outcome, tried to gauge his reaction. Finally, he looked up. "This is going to be controversial," he said quietly. "Some councils will see it as a betrayal of our core principles. But we can't fight the North, not now. We'd lose half the realm to famine if we poured resources into another war." Jon nodded. "I couldn't force them to adopt the Confederation, but I refused to ignore the rights of the small folk. That was the best I could do. The rest is up to the councils." So the debate began. Over the following days, delegates from across the realm converged at Harrenhal to discuss the Northern Treaty. Some accused Jon and Gendry of capitulating to feudalism. Others recognized the pragmatic necessity. Eventually, the majority sided with the protectors, voting, albeit reluctantly, to accept the treaty. The People's Charter had always implied that regions could adapt the principles to local traditions, as long as fundamental rights were respected. They would hold the North to that standard. If the North transgressed, the Confederation reserved the right to defend the small folk. It was a precarious compromise, but better than plunging into another war. In the midst of these negotiations, winter's chill sank deeper. The roads became treacherous, caravans slowed. Harrenhal's central storehouses strained to supply delegates. Frost rimed the edges of the windows in the Great Hall, forcing them to light more braziers. Whispers spread that the first half of winter might be mild, but no one trusted such rumors entirely. People recalled the years of near-eternal cold that had once plagued the realm, and the memory of the White Walkers lingered in older minds. Yet day by day, life continued. The People's Militia patrolled major trade routes. The farmland around the Trident, improved by Gendry's irrigation projects, provided a modest but steady flow of grain. Tormund had gone on a spree of feasting and wenching. As he put it, content to be out of the northern snows for a while. Davos wrote countless letters, coordinating the distribution of resources. Jon oversaw a small expansion of the Confederation's tribunal system, encouraging each region to send more trained adjudicators to deal with local disputes before they erupted into violence. The next crisis came not from within, but from across the seas. Merchants from Braavos brought word that certain Westerosi lords, exiles who had refused the revolution's outcome, were gathering in Essos, hiring sellsword companies. A name that sent a shiver through Westeros's memory surfaced: the Golden Company. They had been battered in earlier conflicts, but pockets of them remained, and they were hungry for gold. Rumor said a new sponsor, a wealthy noble from the Westerlands who had fled after the Revolt, was bankrolling an attempt to retake his lands by force. Others whispered that the Iron Bank, never pleased with governments that might default on old debts, was quietly supportive of any effort to restore the old order and thus the old financial agreements. Gendry brought this news to Jon in the library, where they conferred by candlelight. Stacks of dispatches lay in front of them. Gendry's brow was furrowed with worry. "We suspected the exiled lords might conspire. Now it seems more certain. A few thousand well-trained sellswords could wreak havoc here, especially if they land in the Westerlands or the Reach, where local support might still exist among loyalists." Jon sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "We can't let them get a foothold. If they manage to seize a castle and rally any remnants of the old houses, we'll have another civil war. The Confederation is too fragile to endure that right now." "We need a plan," Gendry said, "and we need it soon." Their plan emerged over the next week, hammered out with the Central Council and the regional delegates. The Confederation's resources were too stretched to send a large army across the sea to intercept the sellswords at their source. Instead, they would strengthen coastal defenses, particularly around the Westerlands and the Reach, where the exiles were most likely to land. They would dispatch envoys to Essos, hoping to learn more about the scale of the threat. And, in a more shadowy sense, they considered employing their own spies or saboteurs, people who could disrupt negotiations between the exiled lords and the sellsword captains. It was a new kind of challenge for a realm that had prided itself on open councils and transparency. Spying, sabotage, clandestine deals, these belonged to the old ways of court intrigues and cunning. Some delegates balked, insisting that the Confederation should only wage war honorably, if forced. But Davos, who had long experience in the murky sides of politics, argued that it would be nigh to face the Golden Company in open battle if they could prevent that confrontation through subtler means. Jon, unsettled by the notion, still admitted the logic. He had learned from the War of the Five Kings and from battles against the undead that survival sometimes demanded grim choices. If the Confederation fell because they refused to adapt, all their ideals would die with it. And so, with reluctance, he approved the formation of a small intelligence network led by a few individuals who had once belonged to various underworld circles. Smugglers, mercenaries, and the like, now loyal to the revolution. They were tasked with infiltrating Essos and sabotaging any attempt to muster a formidable Sellsword invasion. While these quiet preparations began, Gendry oversaw the fortification of several key harbors along the western and southern coasts. Blacksmith forges rose in coastal towns, forging chain links to block harbors if needed, and improved ballistae to defend against ships. The people's militia stationed detachments in these areas, drilling with pikes and crossbows. The presence of uniformed peasants working alongside local fishers and merchants struck many as surreal. Just a few years prior, such a scene would have been unimaginable. But now, day by day, the Confederation showed it could organize for defense just as effectively as any noble house, perhaps more so because the people themselves had a direct stake in safeguarding their freedoms. Months slipped by, and the deeper snows came at last, blanketing much of the Riverlands, the Reach, and the Westerlands. Travel slowed to a crawl. Harrenhal itself took on a stark beauty under the soft white drifts, though the castle's labyrinthine corridors remained drafty. Council sessions grew smaller in number. Most delegates stayed in their home regions, managing local affairs. Only a core group remained at Harrenhal, keeping the Confederation's central functions alive. During these quieter weeks, Jon and Gendry found rare moments of respite. Sometimes they walked the castle's perimeter together, stepping carefully over icy stones, discussing not just matters of state, but their personal reflections on how drastically life had changed. Gendry confided that he still felt more a smith than a ruler, uncertain how long he should remain a protector. Jon replied that he, too, had no desire to cling to power. One day, the realm would stand on its own, and they could step away. The question was when. They also spoke of the future, what a Westeros fully shaped by the Confederation's ideals might look like. Schools for commoners, so literacy and knowledge would not be hoarded by a few. Partnerships with the Citadel, though the Maesters remained suspicious. Roads crisscrossing every region, safe from bandits. A system of laws that any man or woman could understand. They knew it was a grand vision, perhaps impossible to achieve in their lifetimes, but the mere thought of it stirred a sense of purpose that helped them endure the difficulties. As the worst of winter settled in, some urgent matters demanded attention. Disease broke out in a cluster of makeshift shelters near Harrenhal, where refugees fleeing lordly retribution had settled. The Confederation's healers, aided by a few former maesters who had joined the revolution, worked tirelessly to contain it. Another outbreak of violence occurred in the Westerlands, where a lordling's nephew attempted to seize a mining town that had declared itself under Confederation protection. The local militia repelled the attack, capturing the nephew and his hired swords. Once again, the Confederation had to organize a tribunal, traveling in the dead of winter to the site. Jon insisted on going with them, despite the biting cold. He and Ghost arrived in the mining town, a bleak settlement perched on a mountainside, the trees around it heavy with snow. With him came a small unit of militia and a robed adjudicator named Mara, who had been a septa in another life. They found the townsfolk nervous but determined. They had built a small council hall out of timber, where they intended to hold the trial. The lordling's nephew, a boy of perhaps 17, was held in a makeshift cell. He fumed with aristocratic pride, refusing to acknowledge the council's authority. The trial, short and tense, ended with a guilty verdict. The nephew had organized a raid that killed or injured a dozen miners. According to Confederation law, that was murder and conspiracy to subjugate free citizens. Many demanded his execution, but Jon, standing quietly at the back, knew that such an act might spark further noble retaliation if word spread that the Confederation was executing highborn children. He approached the bench where the adjudicator deliberated sentence and softly counseled caution. Adjudicator Mara solemnly announced a sentence of life at hard labor in the mines, under guard. The crowd roared their approval. They would see him toil as they did. The nephew screamed that his father would come to free him. "Then we'll be ready," said Mara calmly. And so the Confederation turned what might have been a potential martyr for noble families into a symbol of consequence. Even a highborn youth was not exempt from punishment if he waged war on free people. As Jon rode away from the mining town, he felt that old pang of uncertainty. Could a confederation that allowed some lords to remain, like in the north, truly keep punishing other lords' families in the south? The lines blurred with each passing day. But in the end, the principle stood. No one was above the law, and if you refused to abide by the new rules, you faced consequences. News of the sentencing caused uproar in the few scattered enclaves of remaining nobility. Some labeled it the humiliation of the noble class. Others saw it as a sign the Confederation was dangerously consistent. If they could do that to a minor, highborn or not, what might happen to a rebellious adult lord? Fear kept many quiet. In the old days, one or two powerful families might have allied to demand retribution, but the Confederation's expansions and their victory in previous battles had driven home the point. The small folk were no longer docile sheep. The second half of winter arrived in a flurry of storms and freezing nights. Harrenhal's population shrank further, as many families chose to return to their home villages to hunker down. The fortress's enormous feasting hall lay mostly empty. Jon and Gendry found themselves with a smaller circle: Davos, Tormund, a few delegates from the Riverlands, and the loyal scribes who managed day-to-day communications. They kept an ear out for any sign the Sellsword threat was materializing. But the roads from the coast brought no major alarms. Apparently, the exiled lords had delayed their plans, perhaps waiting for spring. Then, one morning, a battered ship arrived at Maidenpool, carrying an injured man who asked for an immediate audience with the Confederation's leaders. The man was identified as one of the smugglers in Davos's intelligence network. Word spread quickly, and within a day, he was escorted to Harrenhal, half frostbitten, clothes in tatters. In a small, dim chamber warmed by a single brazier, he relayed dire news. The exiled lords in Essos had indeed hired a large contingent of the Golden Company, along with other mercenary bands. They were provisioning ships in Volantis. The plan was to sail near the Summer Islands to avoid detection and land an invasion force near the southern coast of the Reach once winter waned. The lord behind it all was rumored to be a wealthy scion of House Hightower, previously thought dead in the final battles of the war. At the mention of House Hightower, Gendry frowned deeply. The Hightowers had once been among the oldest and proudest families in Westeros, second only to the Tyrells in controlling the Reach's resources. If a Hightower heir still lived and had the backing of Sellswords, that spelled real danger. The lands around Old Town were fertile, and if an army of that size landed there, they could quickly rally any discontented lords of the Reach who had been chafing under Confederation changes. They might also attempt to seize the Citadel, forging a claim that the Maesters recognized their rule. Jon listened in silence, a growing heaviness settling in his chest. War again. He had tried so hard to forge a realm without it. But if the exiled lords landed with a professional mercenary army, the Confederation's decentralized militias might struggle in a stand-up fight. They would need to unify perhaps more than ever. Davos asked the smuggler, "How large is this force?" The smuggler shook his head. "Hard to say. Thousands, at least." The Golden Company was weakened in the last war, but with other smaller companies, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 total, plus however many knights or men-at-arms from Westeros who might join once they land. Tormund snorted. "We've beaten bigger armies before." Davos nodded slowly. "Yes, but not without cost, and not without a solid chain of command. Our militias are scattered." Jon turned to Gendry, voice quiet. "We might have to muster an army ourselves, more centralized than we've ever done. If they land in the Reach, the local militias alone won't hold." Gendry's jaw tightened. "That's exactly what we tried to avoid, becoming a new monarchy's army. But we can't let them destroy us." So it was decided. The Confederation's Central Council would call for a general levy of volunteers from all member regions to form a unified defensive force, led by experienced veterans of the Revolt. This would be no mass of peasants with pitchforks, but a coordinated army with training and discipline. The People's Militia Registry helped identify those who could be called to the front lines. Smiths across the realm began forging weapons and armor in earnest. Stores of grain and salted meat were set aside to support the troops. Scouts and Scouts Outriders were dispatched to the southern coasts, tasked with sending ravens at the first sign of sails. Over the next weeks, as the days slowly lengthened, men and women trickled into Harrenhal and other mustering points. They came from the Riverlands, the Crownlands, the Stormlands, the Westerlands, even a few from the Vale. Each carried the Confederation's emblem on their tabards, a symbol that they fought for the cause of common rule, not under the banner of any single house. Hedge Knights, too, arrived, some drawn by a sense of guilt for their past loyalties, others simply seeking a place in a new order. Training camps sprang up in the fields around Harrenhal. In time, tens of thousands of folk, some barely old enough to wield a sword, others hardened by prior wars, assembled. Jon walked among the recruits daily, speaking with them, ensuring they had what they needed. Many recognized him, some from rumor, others from memory of the earlier revolts. "He's the one who killed the Night King," whispered a few, though the story was not quite accurate. Jon never bothered to correct them in detail, but he gently reminded them that in this army, every person's life mattered. "Stick together," he told them, "and we'll stand a chance." Gendry led a team of smiths who worked day and night to churn out pikes, spears, shields, and crossbow bolts. The clang of metal echoed through Harrenhal's courtyards as shipments of raw iron arrived from the Westerlands mines. The labyrinthine vaults under the castle stored the finished arms, which were distributed daily to new arrivals. Gendry's dedication impressed even the most seasoned crafters. He oversaw everything personally, from the forging temperatures to the final balance of a spearhead. In quieter moments, he confided in Jon that the only thing keeping him sane was the steady rhythm of hammer on anvil. Spring arrived, or at least the rumor of spring. Winter's deep freeze began to ebb, and the snow melted into muddy roads. That was precisely the time intelligence suggested the exiled lords would strike. Eyes turned south, to the coasts near Old Town or the Arbor, expecting sails on the horizon. A single raven arrived from Dorne, bearing unexpected news. The Lords of Sunspear had decided, after much internal debate, to side with the Confederation if the exiled lords landed near their borders. The delegate from Dorne wrote that while many in Dorne still enjoyed their distinct culture and partial autonomy, they loathed the idea of a Hightower restoration that might overshadow them. This was a potential boon. Dorne's cavalry and archers were formidable, and the southern deserts could be brutal to an invading force if it chose that route. Then it happened. A rider arrived at breakneck speed from the southern coast, half dead with exhaustion, delivering the news that sails had been spotted off the Shield Islands. A large fleet, flying no clear banner, but rumored to be transporting thousands of sellswords. Within days, more ravens confirmed the rumor. The exiled lords had landed near the mouth of the Honeywine River, not far from Old Town, and were marching inland. Several minor houses in the Reach had already joined them, raising their old sigils and rallying scattered knights. A golden banner was rumored to be at the vanguard, the insignia of the Golden Company. Jon and Gendry wasted no time. They dispatched orders for the newly assembled Confederation army to march south. Harrenhal's central courtyard turned into a staging ground. Columns of spearmen, crossbowmen, and a small cavalry contingent formed up. Jon rode at the head, Ghost pacing by his side. Gendry rode beside him, hammer slung across his back, though he had never particularly enjoyed horseback. Tormund led a ragged but fierce group of fighters from the far north, free folk among them. Davos came, too, not as a warrior but as a strategic advisor, calling upon his knowledge of terrain and logistics. The days of travel were harsh. Muddy roads slowed them down, and the early spring rains turned fields to muck. But the Confederation's spirit was strong. Many soldiers insisted on forging ahead, camping in the open or in whatever holdfast welcomed them. Towns and villages along the way offered bread and lodging, remembering how these protectors had championed the rights of small folk. As they approached the outer lands of the Reach, The devastation of previous wars was still evident. Burned farms, gutted barns, communities that had struggled to rebuild. Here, some of the local militias joined the main force. Others stayed behind to guard their own territory. Word trickled in of the exiled lords' progress. They had moved up the Honeywine, capturing a few small keeps. Old Town, with its massive walls and the citadel, had declared neutrality for the moment, though rumors suggested the Hightower presence inside the city was conflicted, some loyal to the exiled claimant, others wanting to avoid another siege. Jon took advantage of the Confederation's knowledge of local allies. They plotted a route that minimized large open-field engagements until they could gather more forces. Skirmishes inevitably occurred. Companies of Sellswords scouted ahead of the main exiled army, clashing with Confederation outriders. Crossbow bolts flew between hedgerows. The Confederation's numbers were large, but discipline was untested in pitched battles. Sellswords, while fewer, were professional and cunning. After a few days of hit-and-run tactics, it became clear that a major confrontation was unavoidable. Both armies converged on a broad plain north of Old Town, near a shallow stretch of the Honeywine. The exiled lords needed to push further inland to secure supply lines, while the Confederation sought to block their advance and defend the many villages behind them. Sunrise found Jon's army spread across a ridge overlooking the river. Tents flapped in a chilly breeze. Soldiers, many of them peasants who'd trained for a few months, gripped their spears with trembling hands. Veteran fighters walked the lines, offering encouragement. Gendry was among them, checking that shields were properly strapped, that sword edges were honed. Tormund paced like a caged direwolf, eager for the fight. Davos rode from unit to unit, ensuring the officers had final instructions. A double-line formation for the spearmen, crossbowmen behind, cavalry on the flanks, prepared to envelop the enemy if they charged. Late in the morning, the Sellsword host appeared in the distance, marching in tight columns. Their banners gleamed, golden elephants, skulls with golden eyes, some smaller mercenary insignias. Intermixed were the standards of exiled Westerosi lords, a scattering of familiar heraldry that had once fluttered proudly in the times of kings. The ground shook faintly with the tramp of disciplined feet. Jon watched them from the ridge, remembering how many times he had prayed never to see such a mass of armed men again. But here they were. A hush settled across the Confederation lines as the Sellswords formed up on the opposite bank of the river. Commanders barked orders. Pennants snapped in the wind. One bold group, their armor shining, rode forward. Officers of the Golden Company, presumably. They brandished horns that unleashed a deep, echoing note. Jon took a moment to breathe, feeling the heavy weight of responsibility. Then he raised his own horn. The call resounded along the ridge. Swords unsheathed, crossbows were drawn, and the Confederation's battered but resolute banners rose. No house sigils, only the emblem of the free folk of Westeros. In that moment, they ceased to be farmers or smiths or innkeepers. They became soldiers defending their dream of a realm ruled by the many, not the few. The Sellswords advanced, crossing the shallow parts of the Honeywine. Confed archers loosed arrows, crossbowmen fired volleys. Horses reared, men cried out. Chaos erupted. The Golden Company's vanguard pressed on, their shields locking in a disciplined testudo formation. Pikes from the Confederation line braced for the impact. Shouts mingled with the clang of steel. The plain became a swirl of mud, blood, and men screaming. Jon fought near the front, Longclaw flashing in arcs of practiced precision. Ghost darted between the melee, snapping at the legs of enemy horses. Gendry led a small reserve, hammering literally into whichever section of the line began to waver. Tormund, wild with battle lust, bellowed curses in the old tongue of the free folk, hacking down Sellswords in vicious sweeps of his axe. Davos remained back, guiding the flow of reinforcements. At first, the Confederation line held well. The pikes repelled the initial cavalry charge, and archers rained arrows on the Sellsword infantry. But the professionals regrouped. A wedge of well-armored mercenaries hammered into a weaker point on the Confederation's right flank, threatening to split the line. Word spread that a band of exiled knights had circled around to attack from the rear. Confusion and fear rippled among the peasant soldiers. Jon galloped to the threatened flank, rallying them with shouts. "Hold your ground! Remember why you fight!" He clashed with the Wedge's leaders, parrying a blow from a tall mercenary in gilded armor. Ghost snarled, leaping at the man's steed. Jon seized the opening to thrust Longclaw upward, unhorsing the mercenary. The impetus of that charge stalled. Meanwhile, Gendry dashed to the rear lines, where exiled knights threatened to rout the crossbowmen. He and his hammer-wielding detachment tore into them. The hammer crashed into shields, splitting them like kindling. War horses kicked and screamed as they were confronted with the unexpected ferocity of rank-and-file peasants fighting for their own freedom. The knights, lacking the near-automatic superiority they'd once enjoyed, faltered. Still, the Sellsword's discipline was formidable. The Golden Company advanced in pockets, pushing deeper into Confederation lines. Casualties piled up on both sides. The mud became slick with red, corpses half sunk in the churned ground. For a moment, it seemed the Confederation might break under the relentless pressure of professional arms. But the peasants refused to run. They remembered the Lord's cruelty, the burned villages, the child who had died with an arrow in his side. They might be outmatched in skill, but they outnumbered the mercenaries, and their determination was unbreakable. The turning point came when Tormund, leading a contingent of wildlings and outriders, managed a surprise flank attack through a copse of trees. They slammed into the Sellsword's side, spreading panic. Davos coordinated a renewed surge from the center. Gendry regrouped his detachment and launched a furious assault that shattered a mercenary shield wall. Jon struck down a mercenary captain carrying the Golden Company's banner, severing the staff with a single stroke. Confusion rippled through the ranks of Sellswords. Many had joined for gold, not for a cause. Seeing their banner fall, they began to lose heart. One by one, the mercenary lines broke. Some tried to surrender, others fled across the Honeywine, discarding their armor to swim. The exiled lords, scattered among the host, realized the day was lost. A few tried to rally, but found themselves drowned out by the chaotic retreat. As the sun sank low, the Confederation's horns echoed across the plain, signaling victory. The battered peasants and free folk raised tired cheers. Jon stood amidst the carnage, breathing heavily, Longclaw dripping with gore. Ghost limped beside him, panting from exertion. Gendry found them, face streaked with blood and mud, hammer resting on his shoulder. Their eyes met, and for an instant, in the swirl of noise and death, they shared the same exhausted relief. They had done it. They had faced down the greatest challenge yet to the New Order. But as bodies lay strewn around them, friends and foes alike, any sense of triumph felt hollow. War was always a horror, even when waged for a just cause. In the aftermath, the Confederation offered quarter to those Sellswords who surrendered. Many accepted, having no particular loyalty to the exiled lords. The lords themselves either lay dead on the field or were hunted down by Tormund's outriders. A few were captured alive. Among them was the rumored Hightower heir, discovered gravely wounded near a collapsed standard. The Confederation placed him under guard, promising he would face a tribunal for crimes of invasion and murder. That evening, a makeshift camp sprang up near the battlefield. Healers moved among the wounded. Cooking fires burned low. Jon and Gendry oversaw the grim task of identifying the dead. Veteran rebels recognized old comrades who had fought in previous battles, now lying in the mud. Tormund found a quiet spot to drink from a skin of mead, subdued in a way few had ever seen him. Davos organized burial details, his weathered face lined with sorrow. Yet word of the victory spread fast. Within days, runners carried the news to every corner of Westeros. The Confederation had repelled an invasion by the Golden Company. No new king or noble faction would seize the realm. The experiment of common rule had survived its greatest test of arms yet. That single fact might do more to cement the Confederation's legitimacy than any number of charters or speeches. As the battered army limped back toward Harrenhal, Pushing through spring rains, villagers emerged from their homes to cheer them. Some offered fresh bread, others mead. In many a hamlet, people spread flower petals in the roads. The protectors, Jon Snow and Gendry Baratheon, tried to wave off the adulation, insisting that every soldier who fought deserved the same praise. Still, the common folk could not help but see them as the guiding spirits of this revolution. They had stood in the thick of the battle, leading from the front, no less brave than any lord from history's stories. At Harrenhal, a grand gathering convened to decide what to do with the captured exiled lords and mercenary officers. Some delegates argued for swift execution to set an example. Others suggested offering clemency, hoping to show that the new realm did not thrive on bloodshed. In the end, the Confederation reached another uneasy compromise. The Common Cell's words were released after pledging never again to serve an invading force against the Confederation. If caught, they'd face death. The officers who'd led them were sentenced to extended labor or imprisoned for a set number of years, after which they could choose to remain in Westeros under Confederation law or return to Essos. The exiled lords, including the Hightower heir, would be tried for treason and, if found guilty, face life imprisonment. Such measures, though harsh, were far less brutal than what most lords of the old days would have dealt out. In the months that followed, peace settled more firmly over the realm than it had in living memory. Small pockets of resistance or loyalist sentiment remained, but nothing organized enough to threaten the Confederation. The winter's hardest days had passed. With spring, the farmland near the Trident and across much of Westeros sprouted fresh green shoots. The roads, though still muddy, were safer than they had been in years. People spoke freely, bartered openly, and for the first time, felt that they had a say in the laws that governed them. Jon and Gendry took this moment of relative calm to meet with the Central Council, discussing the path forward. When it was suggested they remain protectors for life, both men shook their heads. "We will step down," Jon announced, surprising many. "Not immediately, but soon. The realm should not depend on any single figure. We wanted to build structures that live on without us." Gendry nodded. "We'll help shepherd the realm through the next transition. But the Confederation must learn to stand on its own. Otherwise, we're just a new monarchy by another name." A wave of concern rippled through the hall. Some delegates worried that without Jon and Gendry, the Confederation might splinter. But the protectors insisted it was time to trust the people's councils, to trust in the structures they had created. The Assembly agreed to give them a year's transition period to train successors, finalize key governance details, and then they would relinquish the formal title of protector. In that year, they worked tirelessly. They traveled the regions, ensuring the new courts, militias, and councils functioned smoothly. They met with the Citadel, forging an uneasy understanding that while the Maesters would remain a neutral order of knowledge, they would not actively conspire against the Confederation. They addressed a final complication in the Iron Islands, where a new generation of Ironborn leaders reached a tenuous accord, promising limited raids only against foreign targets. An uneasy arrangement, but better than endless bloodshed on the western coast. Finally, as the next spring blossomed, a grand convocation of all councils was called again at Harrenhal. Delegates thronged the courtyard, banners of free communities fluttering in the mild breeze. The last year had seen more farmland reclaimed, more roads repaired, and a general sense that a lasting peace was within reach. In the Great Hall, Jon Snow and Gendry Baratheon stood before the Assembly one final time as protectors. Jon's hair was threaded with a few more streaks of gray, and Gendry bore new scars, but both men retained the quiet resolve that had carried them through so many trials. They addressed the crowd, emphasizing that this was not a farewell but a passing of responsibility. "We have done what we could," Jon said, voice firm but tinged with emotion. "Now the realm belongs to you, to the councils, to the people. We trust you will guard it well." Gendry followed, lifting his old smith's hammer. "This hammer is a symbol of work, of forging what we need. Keep forging this realm, keep improving it, because it'll never be perfect. But it'll belong to the people who build it." A thunderous applause erupted, delegates from every corner of Westeros stamping their feet. Some wept openly, recalling the sacrifices made. from burned villages to mighty battles. Others simply stood in awe of how far they had come. Outside, in the castle yard, thousands of onlookers cheered, the sound echoing off Harrenhal's blackened walls. After the applause subsided, Davos Seaworth stepped forward. The old smuggler had been chosen as interim chair of the Central Council, a reflection of the trust he had earned. He presented Jon and Gendry with a simple wooden plaque, etched with the Confederation's emblem. "In gratitude," he said, voice trembling slightly, "for lighting the way when no one else dared." Neither Jon nor Gendry wanted grand monuments or riches, but they accepted the plaque with humble nods. Davos then proclaimed their term as protectors complete. The assembly roared its approval. No lord knelt. No crowns changed hands. There was only the recognition that these two men had done their duty and now returned authority to the people. Later, in the hush that followed the day's celebrations, Jon Snow stood by the waters of the Trident, watching as the river's gentle current carried fallen leaves downstream. Ghost sat beside him, muzzle resting on paws. Footsteps crunched behind him. Gendry appeared, crossing his arms. Neither man wore the cloak or insignia of protectors anymore, just plain clothes. "Funny," Gendry remarked. "I almost don't know what to do with myself now." Jon smiled faintly. "You'll find a forge. I'll find a quiet place. Maybe we'll just watch the realm grow." Gendry nodded. It's in good hands, I think. Doesn't mean there won't be problems. But it's better than anything we had before." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the water. Overhead, the clouds drifted across a brightening sky. The threat of war, for now, had receded. Across Westeros, small folk tended fields, hammered iron, baked bread, and gathered in local assemblies to shape their own futures. The days of lords and ladies dominating every waking moment were done, or at least irrevocably changed. Jon ran a hand over Ghost's thick fur. He thought of his mother and father, both of them. He thought of Sansa, Arya, and the rest of his scattered family, each forging a path in a transformed realm. He thought of the Night's Watch vows, to shield the realms of men. Perhaps, in a way, he had done so by giving those realms back to the men and women themselves. In time, the two walked back toward the castle, where the bustle of daily life carried on. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter mingling with the clang of forges and the murmur of 1,000 conversations. No one bowed or scraped as Jon and Gendry passed. Instead, the people greeted them with easy familiarity, as neighbors, as friends, or as the men who had helped make the impossible real. Thus, in a land where once the question of who should sit upon the Iron Throne had drowned the continent in blood, a new age dawned. An age of common councils, elected guardians, and a shared dream that each harvest, each anvil strike, each newborn child might inherit a realm that belonged to all, not the few. Over time, legends would arise of how the bastard of Winterfell and the bastard of King Robert Baratheon led a mighty revolt that changed the nature of power itself. Some would say they were the true kings. Others would say they were the realm's first and last protectors, who voluntarily laid aside authority. But those who knew the truth would remember them simply as men who cared enough to free the realm from its own traditions, forging with sweat and blood a future where every voice could be heard. And though no bard or maester could predict the distant tides of history, the people of Westeros, at least for a generation, lived in a realm that dared to govern itself. In the shade of Harrenhal's broken towers, in the forges of the Trident's villages, and in the fields across a once divided continent, men and women walked with heads held high, forging an uncharted path. The future, uncertain as it was, belonged to them, a testament to the power of unity and the courage of two bastards who refused to be kings.